Very good morning, everyone. Welcome to the second day of the UN Science Policy Business Forum, Stockholm plus 50 edition. My name is Axel Threlfall. I'm with Reuters out of London. It's a cozier gathering today, so if you feel you want to move forward, do move forward. Hopefully there will be people coming in shortly from a very rainy street outside. We've got another fantastic day lined up for you today. Sector transitions and creating impact, from pledges to action on the road to the next climate COP. Later on this afternoon in the theatre just across the way there, we're going to host a mini TED-style closing with leaders who are going to share their vision and inspiration for Stockholm plus 100. And shaping our common future. After that, we're going to head, as I said yesterday, into the gardens, the Kunstgarden, to unveil the Transformers exhibition, the 50 by 50 legacy digital art for Stockholm plus 50. We're also going to enjoy the Concert for Peace and the Planet by double Grammy-winning composer Ricky Kedge, presented by Ellie Goulding, and I am assured the sun is going to be shining a little bit later on. Just a very quick word on what we heard yesterday. I don't want to spend too long on this before we start, but some of the perspectives shared point very clearly to the urgent need to deploy and finance the best technologies to power this transition, a more effective multilateral system requiring greater collaboration across sectors. We concluded that accountability, transparency, and access to data and knowledge are, of course, essential to the success of the multilateral system and multi-sectoral collaboration. The need to create demand for sustainable products and to grow and finance green technology markets, et cetera, et cetera. It was a super day of panels, and I think we got a lot out of it. Just before I hand to the first session, which will be nature-positive sector transitions and the need to double the speed of progress, I would first, though, like to give the floor to Sonja Layton-Cohn. Sonja is Acting Deputy Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Programme. Sonja, come on up.
Excellencies, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. I'm pleased to welcome you to the start of a new beginning of our deliberations today. Our discussions yesterday made it clear that the multilateral system must evolve now in a direction where we put the science into action and empower society to have access to the latest green technologies that have the potential to help humanity address the planetary crisis without leaving anyone behind. We have all the multilateral tools that we require to act, the voluntary and legally binding agreements that have been made over a number of years. The world needs to do much better to bridge the gap between knowledge and tools and actual implementation. Today, we will talk about transitions and transformations. Our conclusions will inform the echelons of decision-making across the UN, policy and industry. We have an exciting program and the opportunity to shape the future. So let us begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sonja. Right, let's start today's session with a vision setting on nature-positive sector transitions and the need to double the speed of progress. We heard from Harry Verhaar yesterday. He's going to lead this session. Harry is Head of Global Government and Public Affairs at Signify and founding member of the UN Science Policy Business Forum. He's also chair of the European Alliance to Save Energy. Come on up, Harry. The floor is yours, and then we'll throw a few questions at him after we've heard from him. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Axel. So is it working? Yep, it's working. Yeah, so Shireen asked me also when preparing for this summit, what are really important subjects. And what you see, and we saw that in Glasgow, is that we're finally moving from the question, why and what needs to be done, to how to do this, and to advance the speed of action. And in that sense, we have a long experience in the lighting sector, so it will not have gone unnoticed to all of you. But it also shows then that if you go from the one technology to the other, which is more climate friendly, it's not like flipping a switch, and not even for lighting. This was like flipping a switch, and so that's why in a minute or 8 that I've got, I wanted to share some of our experience. It's important to start with the fact that I came back end of 2003, actually, from living 5 years and working for 5 years in Latin America as a marketing manager for Europe, for what we call our professional lighting, which is the biggest part of our business. So you have, let's say, lighting for residential, but then all professional applications, street lighting, retail, offices, industry, sports, not to forget. And question was there, what can we actually do in terms of marketing strategy to further improve the business? And we don't believe, also at that time, we didn't believe in just selling more stuff and doing discounting campaigns and taking some share from somebody else, because the other day it would be the other way around. So we saw much more that actually more energy efficient solutions were penetrating in the market real slow. Like many innovative solutions, they have to cope with the lower initial price tag of all technology. That is quite a bit of a focus, not only of consumers, but also of public procurement. Looking at lowest initial cost, where actually we know that over lifetime we then pay the cost, we pay a higher cost, but also we don't enjoy the benefits of all those innovations. So what we did at the time, and it was also then when we saw the European Parliament was thinking about how do we translate the Kyoto Treaty into European regulation. And I felt we can do 2 things, and that is also when I brought the lighting industry together, so with GE, with Osram, with Sylvania and some others. And I said, we got 2 options. We can do nothing, we can hide and stay away and say, let's go to the other sector, go to the steel sector, go to the cement boys, or whatever, but we are fine. But then still you'll have regulation with a lot of bureaucracy, and this is not going to be helpful, not for anyone. So the other option we have is that we work together through the association on subjects that we are allowed to work together, and then building also a database on how much does lighting matter, what technology exists, what can happen, what is needed in regulation, and how much mitigation, how much carbon benefits can be obtained if regulation would be created to do that, to cut down on CO2 emissions. So that is what we did at the time. So this was like 2004, 5, 6 with the European Commission. The commissioner at the time for energy, I think, was one of the best the Commission ever had, was Anders Piebox. And he shaped the eco-design of energy using product directive. And it's still very important today because it's being recast and now to become much broader and also take circularity into account. But at the time, so the eco-design directive was framed to advance more energy efficient solutions. So the most important regulatory instrument that was created was minimum energy performance targets. Minimum energy performance standards, I should say, that's the official term. And that gradually then took into account that for every application segment, the older technology, initially in lighting, but also in white goods and computers, anything that had a plug and consumed electricity, would be within the scope of that regulation, and that's what happened. And that is also why you see how Europe is ahead of many other regions in that. We also felt that, maybe one remark there, what you may not fully realize, of course, we all know the example of incandescent light bulb and compact fluorescent lamp, which is now already succeeded by LEDs, but every application segment had such an example. Actually, in Sweden, in street lighting was one of the countries that were most on old mercury lighting for street lighting, and you already had many more efficient solutions. Same for office lighting. I think you'll remember the thick fluorescent tubes with magnetic ballast. and actually had many more efficient solutions existing. In every segment, this was the case. So if you added all of that up, then the potential global savings are roughly 270 billion euro per year, and like 1,200 megatons of CO2, so mattering quite a bit. And at the time, also we shared all those data with the Commission. Lighting was 19%, almost 1/5 of global electricity consumption. It was the largest homogeneous sector that existed. So what happened is then we also felt as a company, you need to walk the talk, you need to create milestones, and let's also show how you walk the talk. So in December 2006, I remember vividly, we organized an event in Brussels, and because of the unique nature, we got the European Parliament to do this, where we made a global call to phase out incandescent light bulbs. And I don't know if let's say, many of you remember, but this was world headline news. I had such a stack of newspaper clippings from all around the world, because this was really, it was unique, but it was also very symbolic, but also very necessary. Because if you realize, the incandescent light bulb was the first mass electric appliance ever. So when our grandparents or great-grandparents got electricity, there was nothing. There were no shavers, there were no blenders, there was no TV, there was no radio. The incandescent light bulb was really the first mass electric appliance. But also, in that sense, it was symbolic. But also, it turned only 1% of input energy, if you start from the utility, into light. So it was more like a heating device and not like lighting. But that's what it was. But also, it was two-thirds of our sales volume in 2006. Even then, like more than 100 years after we were founded in 1891. So in essence and implicitly at the time, we then called for we were world market leader, #1, we still are today, but then in essence we called for the global phase out of all of our portfolio. And that was also the unique nature when you saw how the media and politics reflected on this. How can a company do this? How can they be so foresighted? And we felt that in this whole race, let's say not to save the planet, but to save humanity, and let's be honest on that, you need to be looking at how do we cannibalize our own portfolio? How do we transition to more, let's say, to more climate-friendly solutions? How do we go to carbon neutrality? We made a commitment in 2015 in Paris to become carbon neutral in 5 years, which we accomplished in September 2020. So all these things, I think, so for part, how do you shape the whole transition in your sector? And we'll have panels on fashion and on mining. But how do you shape this whole transition? How do you stay ahead? Because also one important factor that we saw is what did it do to competition? So I'll say a few words on, let's say, the global scope first. So we did this in Europe. And interestingly, I think also as you look at the difference between Europe and America, so Europeans quite often have the better ideas first, but then it takes a lot longer and much more discussions had to create regulation. And as in the US, not everybody reads the global news. We repeated this call to phase out incandescent light bulbs in March, on March 15, 2007 in Washington on the Hill. And it was actually a bipartisan event. And there we didn't talk much about climate, but we talked about energy independence, we talked about cost for consumers, and those kind of things. So that really stuck. And then in the US, they picked up the idea a little later, because it was March. But then already in December that year, lighting became a chapter of the Energy Independence and Security Act, signed by George Bush, so there was a Republican president, Nancy Pelosi, still around, and Robert Byrd, who was then chairing the Senate. I still have it stuck on the wall because they sent it to me. So there was also an interesting race between Europe and the US. How do we do this? But then next to the US, then actually all the OECD countries started doing this. Can you imagine in 2007 and 2008, I got calls like, yeah, this is the office of the Prime Minister of South Korea. We want to visit you and talk about lighting. Went to Australia, New Zealand. So all the OECD countries followed. And then, what was interesting, I think it was 2007 and 2008, we spoke with Achim Steiner, who was then heading UNEP, and his team, and said, okay, for all those emerging developing countries, this is even more important, because if you cannot afford, like I said yesterday, if you cannot afford energy saving, you certainly cannot afford the energy. So we also need to see how can we help emerging developing countries to make the same transition, and for part to leapfrog to more modern technologies, also looking at business models, how to finance and all those things to take away those hurdles. So this really became a global program. And you see today, so last year we did an update on the statistics. Lighting was down from 19 to 12% of electricity. And we see in 2030 it will be down to 8%. And of course, concurrently, that energy needs to become clean. And then we will have made this 1,200 megaton contribution to tackling climate and keeping us within what you could call livable boundaries. 1.5 C is not an objective, but it's like a livable boundary. So what I would like to share there also a few things on competition. You can see there also in sector transitions, and I think this is also useful for mining and for fashion to think about. What we also learned, it's not the large who eat the small, but it's the fast who eat the slow. We saw that at the time when we started this program, we were 3 companies more or less of the same size globally. Number 2, number 3, they went in the same direction but slower. And they're no longer around. So let's say big global brands no longer around in lighting. We are now 85% LED lighting and connected LED lighting, so providing all kinds of user benefits. And again, world leader. So I'm not saying this to, let's say, to do some chest thumping. We're not like that as Europeans, and certainly not as Dutch. But to show like it's quite unique, because you see other sectors had like, let's say Kodak or BlackBerry has. So then they were world market leaders, but then they were slower in the transition, and immediately, let's say, your survival as a company is at risk. What we also see there, and I think that is for the next 2 panels, is that an integrated approach is essential. So it's not just having portfolio. You need indeed the regulation, but also you need to look at your whole supply chain, so upstream and downstream. For us, this was a huge industrial transition. At the time in 2006 and 2007, we made a whole plan. So how do we actually globally phase out incandescent light bulbs? Because this was not just like putting some other products on the shelf and we're done with it. It also meant how do we transition all those wattages? How do we make this understandable for consumers in retail and do-it-yourself outlets? And also there we agreed with the European Commission that this would be a stepwise phase-out, which kicked in on the 1st of September 2009, 2010, 11, and 12. And then it went actually initially higher wattages, medium wattages, lower wattages, and then, let's say, the remainder part of the portfolio. And this was also really important because that first step on 1st of September 2009 already meant that we had to reposition 25 kilometers of retail and DIY shelves. So there's also a capacity issue if you go through a transition. That's my message there. We also at the time had 14 factories worldwide that produced incandescent light bulbs. And we foresaw that within 8 years, we have to close 13 of those. So we also included restructuring, which was triple-digit millions of euros. So that was also part of the plan. So if you shy away from the industrial and restructuring implication, also we looked at people. How can we rescale people and all of that? So that is what I would call an integrated plan. So any advice from me to any other sector is also make this like an integrated approach. Then maybe to end up, also given time, there's some learning. So I mentioned, so you really need to have a vision. So our vision had to do with, okay, what does this new lighting bring? And it was very early on that we advocated this would be a triple win. So a triple win for the quality of our living environments, an economical triple win, because you can imagine those 270 billion euro annual savings are divided over households, over cities. Half of a city's energy bill is lighting, street lighting, public office and schools, companies, retail. And thirdly, what I would call social people benefits. We see with the better lighting technology that nighttime traffic accidents can be reduced by 30%. I know Stockholm is considering then changing to LED street lighting. We see now from 10 cities around the world, has been a research from the World Council on City Data a couple of years ago, on Los Angeles, Buenos Aires, and a number of other cities, that nighttime traffic accidents, which is 40% of all traffic accidents, are reduced by 30%. Street crime, so assaults and burglary, reduced by 21%. And why is that, you would think? Because light is light and white is white. But in technical terms, with LED lighting, you have a better vertical recognition, which then means, in layman's terms, people make less mistakes, so fewer accidents, and they are less naughty, so less crime. And we see the same in fashion. So then also in fashion, we see that the good lighting makes let's say, all the garments stand much more beautiful. And also you can lead people through your shop. You can vary the lighting at home. I guess some of you, or maybe many of you, already have LED lighting at home. You can now even talk to it. You could say like romantic, or you could say party. And those things were unimaginable with old technology. So I would say also there, one lesson learned is let's look at the benefits of new technology. Same for electric driving. It doesn't smell and it doesn't make noise. So that's the second lesson. Work together as an industry sector. And I think the last thing that I would like to say is really think through, and I think all of us do it in a way, that you can also communicate to anyone else that the best way to serve any self-interest is to invest in the common interest. I think there, I mentioned yesterday, you know the concept win-win, lose-lose, and win-lose in the middle. If you go for win-lose, in the end, it will always end up in lose-lose. So that is also why we, and also UNEP, make such a big effort of bringing us all along and acting on the Paris Agreement. But I sincerely, deeply believe that we are best off if we jointly invest in the common interest. And that is what we try to do with lighting. There's still quite a bit of work to do, but I hope this is actually useful to you and also for the two next panel sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Harry. I've got a couple of questions very quickly that I want to ask before we do the fashion panel. You talk about vision, of course, in the context of advancing globalization. What is the next big thing in lighting?
So there's two things. So like I mentioned, we are 85% LED, so you would say, well, all done. So let's go and look at other sectors. Lighting is done. But what is interesting to note is that also in Europe, where we work on the European Green Deal, still 2/3 of the install base is conventional lighting. And you see there also when you go through a transition, you need to look at not only, let's say, at what is done per year, electric car sales per year, LED sales per year, installed renewable power base per year, but also how do you address the install base? And this is also why it is so crucial in the European Green Deal, but also in Build Back Better in the US, in China, the 14th five-year plan, to see how do we at least double the rate of infrastructure renovation. Because this is actually what we need to address, this large installed base of old technology.
Yep.
And second, if you allow me, Axel, then what is even more exciting is that lighting has become digital. We also launched a technology called Li-Fi. You will be familiar with Wi-Fi, but that's in the radio broadband that you can communicate, but that's getting congested. There are lots of applications where people don't like Wi-Fi. You know, the Pentagon doesn't have Wi-Fi because people can snoop, let's say, on the radio waves. But Li-Fi is actually superimposed data on the light waves. And you can get like a tremendous amount more of data. We see now there's lots of applications where then light is used for communication, for autonomous driving, which is really super fast, as fast as light. In defense, in many other industrial applications, no interference. So those two things.
Yep. Very quick final point. You talk about the fast eating the slow. How much risk-taking is factored in, or should be factored into decision-making and strategy? I imagine a lot of smaller entrepreneurial businesses, a lot of the fast businesses need to take risks.
Yeah, I think the biggest risk is too low speed. We see that with climate. If we are too slow, we are going to have big problems. So the only risk is lack of speed. So the fact that we spoke out internationally on the need to phase out old lighting technology and erase our existing business actually made it, that was the commitment. So there was no way back. So I think also there, even internally, if some people were hesitant to think, hey, can this be done? And it was there. It was like, it was out there. This is what we were doing. And I think everybody is behind this. And also what we see in the lighting industry is that at every level, so junior until 2 years ago, new CFO, people want to work for us. So they think it's super exciting as a sector, but also a company that invests not only in its own results, but in, let's say, in our collective future. That's where we want to work. Good. So we see this people part as maybe even the most important.
Harry, appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Harry Verhaap. Okay, we're gonna move on to the fashion panel. Just before I do that, I was, as a loyal Reuters journalist, I was perusing the Reuters newswire last night, and this was a very timely report, and I'm sure all the panelists are aware of this one. A very timely report from the business of fashion released yesterday. very quickly, I'm going to tell you what it said. The 30 largest listed fashion firms must do more to hit Paris Climate Accord targets and UN Sustainable Development Goals, although some are improving their social and environmental credentials. This is a quote from the sustainability chief at this publication. You've got some front runners making small steps of progress, but fundamentally the big picture is that the industry is wildly underperforming. That is the context that I'm going to leave you with, and I'm going to hand it over now to the capable hands of Shireen Zorba to run this panel. Thanks, Shireen.
A very timely quote. Thank you very much, Axel. He leaves us with that and a bit of a challenge. So this is an exciting panel. In fashion, we called it, turning the needle on the industry's planetary footprint. Please allow me to introduce and welcome my panel, and then I'll tell you a bit more. So Sendiso Khumalo. Sendiso is an award-winning fashion designer and entrepreneur from South Africa. Please. We have Alexandre Capelli. He's environmental deputy director of Louis Vuitton, Moët Hennessy, LVMH. Cecilia Branston. She's head of resources use and circular impact, H&M. And remotely, we are joined all the way from the US at a rather uncomfortable hour with Kenneth Pucker, Sustainability and ESG Professor at Tufts University. Hi, Kenneth, how are you? Thank you for joining us. What time is it?
My pleasure.
What time is it?
It's too early, but I'm glad to be here.
Thank you for being there. We appreciate it. So, let's tell a story here of where we are, and then we will talk to our wonderful panelists about where we want to be and where we are heading. So the fashion industry's value is estimated conservatively at $3 trillion US, which corresponds to 2% of GDP. Total export of clothing is $1.29 trillion annually. In the US alone, consumers spend nearly $380 billion on apparel and footwear every year. The industry, which encompasses everything from textile and apparel brands to wholesalers, importers, and retailers, employs more than 70 million workers globally. 75% of them are women. The fashion industry continues to have positive growth, and the Asian market is forecast to have 38% share of global apparel demand in the past years. Now, let's just have a very quick look at the environmental footprint. The fashion industry produces about 10% of annual carbon emissions, which is more than all maritime shipping and international flights combined. Emissions are projected to grow by more than 50% by 2030, and according to the UN Environment Programme, a staggering 3,781 liters of water is required to manufacture a single pair of jeans. So this gives us an idea that consumerism and fast fashion and the practices of the past years have definitely had their impact in so many different ways, from production to consuming these products to transport and so on. The good news is the industry is transitioning very seriously towards a greener, more sustainable path. The question is the transition impactful enough, fast enough, and ambitious enough? To learn more and to better understand the parameters and conditions that could empower this transition and create more nature-positive and circular approaches, as well as a better equity within these sectors, we are very happy to have this panel today who will tell us so much more about what they are doing already, and then where they want to go with this, and how much these efforts would pay off in the future. I'll start actually with Sendiso Khumalo. You are based in Cape Town with a passion for modern and sustainable clothing with an emphasis on African heritage. You won the LVMH award, and you've been motivated to bring values of social equality, female empowerment into your brand. You work with small workshops, and your work was presented actually at the Museum of Modern Art in Denmark, the Smithsonian National Museum of African Art in Washington, at the Zeta Mecca Museum in Cape Town. So congratulations for all that, and please, Sindisu, tell me, what makes your products sustainable?
Thank you for having me. So essentially, for us, sustainability is sort of twofold. It's combination of environmental and social. You know, I really do believe that if you go into any impoverished area in the world, whether it's the slums of Mumbai or the squatter camps in Cape Town, you're going to see huge environmental problems within those areas. So for me, I feel like the two need to be approached together and like almost work quite symbiotically. And so I guess that's what we do with our products is we think about the what, which is the environmental, so how it's made, like what's inside the product, how it's made, is it cotton, is it organic cotton, is it hemp, how long does it take for the product to biodegrade, all of those sort of what questions. And then there's the who, which is the social impact side. So it's who are we working with, are people who are making our clothes being paid a living wage, which workshops are we working with, which programs are we bringing in. So the two kind of work intertwined, and I feel like if you bring your value system, we try to bring our value system into every single product because that's really the only way we're going to make any real impact or change.
How do you describe your business? Would you describe it as a startup? Would you describe it as something bigger? Or
Good question. I think I was telling somebody I've been an emerging fashion designer for 10 years. So
that's a long time.
Yeah. So no, we've been going for 10 years now, but I think. Fashion is one of those industries where it does take time to also find like your voice and what you're really trying to speak about. I mean, I do feel like, yeah, I'd say we're kind of just leaving startup phase and maybe, moving into kind of being a more kind of like, I guess, emerging brand. I mean, that's how it is.
The reason I'm asking that, I wanted to know, do you feel empowered going the path of sustainability at this size? The policies are in place, the incentives are in place to empower you to move forward, or did you find the sustainability path to be a bit of a struggle? It's a choice you made.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, I definitely found the sustainability part to be a huge, it is a struggle, especially if you're in the southernmost part of Africa. Just even sourcing becomes its own, a lot of the sustainable factories that you'd want to work with or material sourcing would all happen essentially in Europe. So yeah, I think definitely on that side. But I guess on the flip side, when it comes to kind of the social development side of things, I live in South Africa. So it's to work and find partners to bring up social upliftment. So I think, yeah, but I do think so, like sustainability is a challenge for a reason. Like, we've gotten this far and we've destroyed the world this far. I think there needs to be like a pullback, it can't just be super easy to do it. But I think it's also like part of the challenge is also the joy and the beauty and the design. So I think the challenge is a good thing. I think the challenge allows you to explore and really be very critical about what you're bringing out. And essentially because we don't need as many clothes as we make on the planet. So, there's also that question consistently is like, is it even necessary, having all these clothes? So, yeah.
I'll come back to that point, but let me go to LVMH for a second and ask, what made her the first choice as the winner of that fashion award, sustainability award? I wanted to know what made you choose her business as the winner of that award for sustainability.
Yeah, we have an image prize dedicated to young designers for now a few years. And at the beginning, the criteria was mainly focusing on creativity because it's all about creativity in fashion mainly. But now for for, I would say, a few years. We are also focusing on sustainability. It's really part of our criteria, both social and environmental. And yes, Indizo, I guess, is one of the most successful on mixing creativity and sustainability, yes. Yeah. Definitely.
Excellent. So now moving from the emerging industries from Africa to LVMH, you are on top basically of the value chain when it comes to the fashion industry. And your brand includes enormous luxury brands like Louis Vuitton, Christian Dior, Givenchy. The company has a market value of $194 billion and assets of more than 108 billion, making it the 73rd largest publicly traded organization in the world. That's a massive business. Now, with that and being on top of that chain, how do you, as a luxury brand, approach sustainability and circularity? And is it a struggle for you?
Yeah, it's a challenge now. At LVMH, it's a long-standing commitment. The environmental department was created in 1992. I went not there, but it's a long-standing commitment. And now the idea is to how can we transition for a basic productive business model to a more circular and regenerative. I will be honest, it's not that easy. And thank you for the ranking introduction of the business of fashion. So we are working on it. We have a new strategy called Life 360. And quickly, it's based upon 4 main pillars to accelerate the transition. The first one is circular creativity. And we have the challenge that all our products will result from eco-design by 2030. And what does it mean for fashion? For instance, we have set the following criteria. It means that at least 50% of the content will be either certified or from regenerative agriculture or recycled. We will need to have traceability, country of origin of the main raw materials, and also something about the end of life of product. Recycling, upcycling, so how can we manage the end of life of the product? Then we have a second target we want to fade out virgin oil-based plastic in packaging for all our packaging by 2026. Quite challenging, especially for perfume and cosmetics. Not that much in fashion, we should be there. And the last point is to accelerate in terms of what we call new circular services. So it's about renting, second-hand, repair services. So now all our brands are offering repair services. Our second pillar is traceability, transparency. So being able to trace all our raw material until the field. And it's quite challenging, you know. Of course, we'll know our tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers, but cotton, wool, leather, they are sometimes tier 4, tier 5, or even tier 6 suppliers. So we have the challenge to be able to trace the whole supply chain. And then transparency to customer, being able to share the environmental and social performance with our customer. Of course, we have the upcoming regulation in France, but also in Europe. But we want to anticipate this kind of regulation worldwide and to share this information with our customers. So we are now step by step implementing tools to calculate the environmental impact of our product and sharing with our customer. Of course, climate. We do have a climate trajectory approved by SBTi, nothing new now. We all have that in the industry. And the last but not least pillar is really biodiversity, which for us is really the key pillar. And for what does it mean for us? It means ensuring that all of our raw materials in fashion, but not only in fashion, for fashion it's cotton, wool, leather, we have many, many different raw materials, will be certified. We are almost there. Then implementing regenerative agriculture. I know it's a trendy topic right now, regenerative practices, but we are starting to implement regenerative practices and talking about accelerating and doubling the speed of progress. I think that this topic of regenerative agriculture is really key for us. So we have started some projects, for instance, cotton in Turkey. We also have wool in South Africa or in Australia. And the last topic is fighting deforestation, achieving a zero net deforestation by 2026 and zero growth by 2030. And for fashion, it's mainly leather. We also have topics of palm oil and paper and wood base, but it's not less for fashion, it's more for packaging.
Let me ask you this. To what extent is the consumer driving your efforts to green?
They are really key, you know. And before consumer, I would say education. At the beginning, we really need to educate first the youth, but also our customers. And to do that, it's all about the environmental performance that we want to share with our customers. So for me, it will be the really super powerful next step to share this information with customers. You know, we all have this A to E labeling on electronics, on other type of products, and soon on fashion. And I think it will be a very powerful lever to inform and to educate the customer. So yes, definitely.
Thank you very much for that, Alexandra. I'll come back to you, but now I want to go to Cecilia. H&M is a leading high street fashion brand and a member of the Race to Zero initiative. And your ambition is to be net zero by 2050, I understand? No?
I'll tell you.
You will tell me.
I'll tell you.
Tell me about what you're doing.
Absolutely. No, but I actually agree with the opening. It's going too slow, and we do have a big footprint, and we have to act, and we have to act now. I think the world is far from reaching the 1.5-degree target, and I think the fashion industry has to do its part. The H&M group that I'm representing has to do its part. So I'm fully convinced of that. I think we believe in the H&M group that a sustainable business is what will make us a resilient and future-proof and customer-oriented business going forward. And actually, yes, we're big, but that could also be turned into a possibility and an opportunity, I think, because the impact that we can create for ourselves and for our value chain can actually have an impact on the whole industry. So I think we should really grasp that opportunity and put commitments in place and act. So that's what we're focusing on. And when it comes to then our climate targets that you mentioned, we have actually set out a quite ambitious ambition while we're doubling our sales to 2030, we will at least halve our emissions by 2030. And we are aligning with science and the net zero standards. So the real kind of SBTi application goal that we have is to reduce our emissions throughout the full value chain by 56% by 2030. And also then achieving net zero 2040. So that's actually 10 years ahead. And we will also then have 10% carbon removals included in that. So yeah, we have a challenge there, of course, but focusing on energy efficiency, renewable energy, of course, and our circular agenda, recycled materials. And you mentioned biodiversity, and I can see we have very similar focus areas, I would say. But on the biodiversity side, we have an ambition to have a net positive impact on biodiversity through preventing and reducing our impact through regenerative, as you said, through our circular agenda and our goals on raw materials, but also protecting and restoring.
Let me go to measurement for a second, and it's a question for the three of you, really. How do you measure your success, and to what extent are there standards that are applied across the industry?
Yeah, no, but I think it's good to align with this, for example, Science-Based Target Initiative and the Net Zero Standard, because then we all do it in the same way, so to say. So therefore, on the biodiversity side, of course, we are awaiting the global goals on biodiversity. It hopefully will come this fall. But already now we're starting to apply, for example, the SBTN method in order to kind of reduce our impact and do it in a similar way. And standards, of course, can also be standards on, for transparency, for example. We're very much involved in the HIG Index and the Sustainable Apparel Coalition HIG Index, where we are also working with transparency, both kind of on us as a brand, our supply chain, but also towards the customers on our products. That's two examples. You want to continue?
Yeah, how do we measure? Of course, we have a classical reporting system for our own operation, but more and more, we are consolidating figures from our supply chain. We are now implementing some traceability tool which allows us to consolidate environmental figures from the whole supply chain, and it really helps us to evaluate the environmental footprint of our global value chain. For instance, again, focusing on biodiversity, we have implemented two different methodologies. The first one is the global biodiversity indicators, which allow us to measure the global biodiversity footprint of our value chain. And the second one, we have implemented a dedicated life cycle analysis using the impact plus methodology. I'm sorry for the scientific details, but yes, we tried to measure very sharply our environmental impact, but the main topic, the main stake is being able to get the figure from our supply chain. So being able to consolidate figures from the farmers, from the suppliers, from the manufacturers. So this is the first challenge. And then, of course, we have tools to measure and to monitor our progress.
Maybe Sandy, so I mean, 10 years on the market already. Do you find that perhaps I'm African, I'm from North Africa. So in our part of the world, do you feel that it's different, or do you feel that we are on the same path in terms of our measurements and our targets?
No,
and maybe our impact, our footprint
I think definitely
is different.
it is. It's definitely more of a challenge in Africa because we have the challenge of like the social inequalities that exist. So, you know, it's really difficult to try to explain to somebody how important it is for us to save the planet when they're just trying to like get food on the table. So I think it's just we're not playing on the same playing fields. And I think that's why the challenge of communicating it in a different way and actually trying to make people understand that they are also stakeholders in how we treat the planet. But it is definitely more of a challenge in Africa.
So a last question to the panel before I move to Kenneth for his commentary from maybe a more kind of, you know, the knowledge side or the academic side. But I want to know, what is next? And are we moving at the right speed? And then finally, what is your biggest challenge that maybe through policy it could be better or it could be resolved? So Cecilia, let me start with you.
Yes, and of course I want to mention, like I'm head of resources and circular impact, so I have to say, of course, for me, circularity is a key tool. Optimizing resources, reducing resource use, eliminating waste and pollution, and make sure that products and material can circulate. I think that's key in order to be able to mitigate the challenge on biodiversity and climate, for example. So I think for us, looking at how we can create products that are designed for circularity, we have a goal there to do that by 2025, moving from conventional material to recycled and sustainably sourced. We have a goal to have 100% recycled or sustainably sourced material 2030 and at least 30% recycled materials 2025. So, and last year we actually tripled the amount of recycled materials in our products. But also I would say reducing our packaging is one important focus area for us, but most importantly, scaling circular business models, making sure that products can be used for longer, used more, they can be repaired, reused, and finally recycled. And here we need incentives, we need policies, and we need systems, we need infrastructure to collect, sort, recycle. We need the customers on board. We need to, there's a lot of things that needs to happen because it's a systemic change which requires that the whole system is involved and acts.
Like if there is one policy that you feel this would be the most impactful, what would that be?
What should I pick? Should I pick the climate? Making sure that we can have power purchase agreements, for example, to increase the number of renewable energy sources, especially in our production market. That's a key focus. But otherwise, I would say incentivizing circular business models and secure that we have efficient sorting, collecting, and recycling systems.
A final one for you, but I have to ask. Being a global business, I think some of us will have H&M in each of our rooms or something. Our children are wearing them and all that. But as a global business, do you find that the policy component might differ from one country to the other, how you need to comply, and to what extent is that a challenge?
Yeah, no, but it does. And I think we're more and more involved, both on an EU level, but also on a local level in our sales and production markets, for example. But of course, a harmonized legislation would make things a lot easier for us. So of course, we like looking at the EU agenda, for example, we're very much involved. I have my colleagues in the audience here. They know this area much better than me. But I think a harmonized approach, of course, is good. But I also see a change, actually, when it comes to policy and legislation, that they're pushing us a lot more now. So before the brands like us, of course, we could run ahead, but I think now the legislation is really pushing as well, which is positive.
I'll come now to you. Well, I can't claim that every house has a Givenchy or a Louis Vuitton or a Dior, but we wish. But you're lucky, right? You're really lucky when it comes to circularity, because in their case, they call it vintage, right? I'm wearing vintage, so circularity might be easier for you, I imagine. But tell me, so from your point of view, what are your biggest challenges, but what is also the way forward that could have an impact, and where is the role of policy from your kind of side of the industry?
Yeah. So do we go at the right pace? I would say yes and no. Yes, some of our targets will be achieved maybe sometimes in advance for packaging, for instance. But no, yes, I would say that what is missing, and I will come back to traceability, that to be sure that the whole value chain is going at the right pace, we need to identify each actor, each supplier, each farmer in our supply chain. And it's not that easy to do that worldwide. So for me, the main challenge is traceability. I know it's just a tool, but it will be a super powerful tool to be able to monitor and to challenge everything. But we are working on it. Then the second challenge is innovation. We rely on innovation to achieve our ambitious target, especially with regard to agriculture. Regenerative agriculture is this new trendy topic, but we will need innovation to accelerate on this topic of regenerative agriculture. What does it exactly mean for cotton? What does it exactly mean for wool, for silk? And again, we are working on it. And I would say education. I come back to education, but for me, it's really, really, really key. We won't achieve our target without education starting at the school. And then regulation. We need regulation. I'm French, so we really need regulation to achieve our targets. And I really rely on all the upcoming regulation in Europe, focusing on product environmental labeling. And I come back to that, sorry, but I think it will be super powerful to educate our customers and to accelerate the transition. And yes, as luxury brands, we are quite lucky because our products are already quite long-standing, with long-lasting product, high quality. So yes, for us, it's a plus. It's a kind of win. But, and we rely a lot on it. But yes, having said that, we need to inform the customer. It will be, for me, the main challenge in the next few years.
Thank you. And before I go to Ken for his kind of wrap-up, I will ask Cindy, so as a woman, as an African, as someone in the industry, to what extent being a sustainable business is opening doors, and to what extent it is not, both in the market on the continent, but also maybe in Europe and outside?
I mean, I think essentially it is opening doors in terms of, I feel like the consumer is slowly beginning to understand that this isn't a quirky add-on to your brand, you know. So I think in terms of like building a customer base, I think it's like definitely opened a lot of doors. I think also I feel I'm part of a generation of, there's, you know, so many of us LVMH finalists are like sustainable designers. I think it's like it's something that we all feel, especially for our generation, is something that we need to take on board now. What was the second question?
In terms of laws and regulations and policies and financing, do you feel you have an edge when you are in the area of sustainability, especially on the continent, in your country, or not really? And what needs to change? If one or two things would change, what would those be?
No, not really at all. I mean, I think more than anything is just sort of like, I think Alexandra has touched on this, is just education from the beginning, like from school, from university. I think that's, for me, such a crucial part. We were talking about my old university lecture. I learned about sustainability when I was doing my master's, you know, like 15 years ago. And then it was like this quirky. But, you know, for me, it was just like, I think education is probably the most important part of this entire conversation because, you know, getting everybody on board has to happen really from like, bottom grassroots level.
Including government.
Sorry?
Including government.
Including government, including educating governments, exactly, 100%.
Thank you so much. Ken, now I want to ask you the last open-ended question of this panel. I want to hear from you, your perspective. You have such a long history in the industry before, also your work as, in academia. But I want to hear your perspective about the transition in the fashion industry and whether it is happening fast enough, robustly enough to produce the desired impact. Over to you.
Thank you. The answer is unequivocally no. Interesting that we're here back in Stockholm because 50 years earlier, at the first UN conference related to the environment, there was a feeling that policy and regulation had a strong role to play in order to transition industry from the challenges that we were seeing environmentally to a sustainable path. And yet, by Brundtland, 15 years later, there was a commitment to sustainable development and more of a focus on corporate voluntary action as the solution to our environmental challenges. And yet, if you look where we are now, we have come through 25 years of reporting, first started with the GRI, and voluntary win-win solutions and measurement, and not much yield in terms of progress, at least from the fashion sector in terms of contribution to environmental stability. We now produce over 100 billion units of fashion annually. And per mention earlier, we need to cut our carbon footprint by 50% by the year 2030 to stay within 1.5 degrees Celsius, when in fact we're headed in the opposite direction. And so, though I appreciate genuinely the challenges that are ahead of all of us, the focus on things like regenerative agriculture and circularity are very nascent. While they have potential, they are less than 1%, represent less than 1% of the output of the industry. And so I do think we need a slightly different approach. The targets that we heard the panelists reference, things like science-based targets or the measurement tools we use like the Higg Index, I think are flawed. Science-based targets is terrific, but it's a voluntary approach. And the commitments that are being made don't come with consequence if they're missed. And in terms of the Higg Index, it actually biases the industry towards less regenerative, less circular solutions. It today rates polyester and other synthetic materials ahead of natural materials, which doesn't lead to a circular approach because, as we know, synthetics are not recyclable or upcyclable. And so I think we have built-in challenges, and we do need a different approach. I'm inspired by the earlier speaker from Signify who talked about the impact of policy on ridding the world of incandescent light bulbs. And I think there's analogy for fashion. I do think the industry as a whole could collectively move together on things like power purchase agreements and the like, if the regulatory environment were to shift. And so one illustration is outside the European theater, which is the leader in terms of regulation, but in the US, there's an approach in New York State, which is called the New York Fashion Act, which is trying to mandate the kind of transparency that Alexandra talked about through the tiers of supply chain. It's also trying to mandate that fashion companies adhere to science-based targets, and it does come with consequence for brands over $100 million of not adhering. I think that's an approach that will lift the floor for the industry and not just have a few leaders drive us with not enough followers, but instead mandate that we collectively as an industry move forward more aggressively.
Thank you very much, Ken. I would love to get your views on that, and I am told that our time is out. One sentence. Do you agree, disagree? What do you think? And I leave the session with the thought to be continued. This is such a fascinating topic, it's such an important topic, and I have a feeling we'll be doing more of that. But very quickly, your thoughts on what Ken said.
No, but there is a clear sense of urgency, but I do believe maybe we don't share exactly the same views on synthetics, and I do believe they're cyclable and all of that, but in essence, we need speed, we need policy, we need change, and we need action now. So I fully agree with that. We will have different ways of getting there, but I would say, the conviction, the sense of urgency is there. I see a willingness in the industry to change. Collaboration will be key doing this, but also standardizations and science-based targets, I think.
I think this is very clear.
No, we are monitoring very closely this new New York regulation, and I think it's a very powerful regulation because coming back to traceability and transparency, it will boost transparency, and I think it will be key. At the corporate level, and again, sorry, but at the product level. So yes, I fully agree on this kind of regulation. It will help the whole industry. And then coming back to collaboration, yes, we do collaborate, even between luxury and fast fashion. We are discussing, and next week we have a very interesting meeting between us in Copenhagen to collaborate. So yes, and coming back to the less than 1%, I agree. On regenerative, but it's much more if we are coming back to organic or recycle. It's not only 1%, it's much, much more. But yes, regenerative, it's still just the beginning.
Cindy, sir?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree, and I mainly really agree on the points of like collaboration and transparency. I think it's just crucial within the industry, but also within the players, within governments. Like there needs to be transparency from everyone. And some form of collaboration so you don't feel like you're doing this thing on your own, especially if you're like emerging like myself. But yeah, absolutely. I think the power of collaboration, and we were talking about this last night, the power of collaboration is really the way that we're going to fast track this process.
I am sure we will have so many comments and questions from the floor. However, we really don't have the time. So I do encourage you to meet the others, have a conversation, to be continued. So Cindy, Alexandre, Cecilia, and Ken, thank you for staying up so late. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll meet again. Thank you.
All right, this is always the hard part of my role, speeding things up when the content is so fascinating. But in the interest of clawing back a little bit of time, I'm going to keep this intro very brief and then get our speakers for the next session straight onto the stage. The extractive industries, this is what we're talking about now. Of course, are some of the headwaters of the global economy, sourcing fossil fuels, metals, minerals, used to fabricate the built environment, and consumables, and traditionally to power industry and transport. Of course, the huge environmental costs, along with the benefits, including water resource stresses, greenhouse gas emissions, habitat destruction, and ecosystem pollution. We are going to throw this around now over the next 30 minutes or so with Harry Fahar's context that he set in the back of our minds. Let me bring up our panelists. Stephen Kokoda, who we heard from yesterday, representing the copper sector and the industry. Sonja Layton-Cohn, who we heard from earlier today, Deputy Executive Director, UN Environment Programme. Welcome back to you, Sonja. Bruno Oberle, Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, and John Houchin, co-convener of the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative. Come on up, take a seat wherever you can. Stephen, what I want to do is give you a few minutes to set the scene here, and I believe we've got a short video as well that you want to play. Why don't you actually come to the podium, do your thing, and then we'll continue the conversation after that.
Great, thank you so much, Axel. It's a pleasure to see all of you again. I'll try not to be repetitive from my remarks of yesterday. I'll just begin by saying that copper is probably connected more closely to the global sustainable development agenda than any other metal or material. We could demonstrate that copper makes a positive impact on nearly all 17 of the UN SDGs. And we do that through partnerships. I mentioned yesterday United for Efficiency. Harry today spoke about the great work that's done with lighting. Well, we built off of lighting, and we said, let's do the same thing with other products. So home appliances, industrial equipment, and we do that through United for Efficiency. I mentioned that we launched an off-grid initiative called CORE, the cornerstone of rural electrification, and I invite you to look up more information about U4E and CORE. But our most recent effort is called GEAR, Grid Efficiency and Resilience, and that aims to increase the supply of electricity to African consumers and businesses without increasing production. And I hope we have the video ready to go because it'll do a better job of explaining GEAR than I will. Technology is great when it works.
Africa stands at the threshold of an unprecedented period of growth in electricity demand, forecasted to be up 7-fold by 2040. In developed countries, total grid losses typically range between 7 and 10%. In Africa, these losses average between 15 and 30% and are as high as 44%. In simple terms, this means that for every 100 watts of electricity that's generated in Africa, as much as 44 watts never make it to the outlet in an African home or business.
We need to act now to make electricity grids more reliable, efficient and resilient. The Grid Efficiency and Resilience Initiative, known as GEAR, is unique in that it will provide free technical assistance and capacity building to all strategic stakeholders in the energy system. The IEA is proud to be part of the GEAR initiative and invites like-minded organisations to join us in putting people at the centre of Africa's clean energy transition. This is essential to the equitable social and economic development of the region.
GEAR adopts a holistic approach to tackle all critical issues and offers technical assistance and capacity building to create an enabling, regulatory and policy environment, to educate utility and non-utility players, reinforce local manufacturing capacities, while facilitating access to finance and the development of a new financing facility in partnership with Mission Efficiency.
In this context, efficiency, reliability and resilience must be embedded in our existing and future grids, simply because every kilowatt hour counts. It is light for our youth to study, energy to produce our means of existence and accelerate our economic and human development.
I am honored to be part of the GEAR initiative and support Africa's transition to efficient and resilient electricity grids. The development of Africa is a global challenge and is very dear to my heart.
It's urgent to act now. Join us.
I think that last bit, if you weren't able to read it, Bernard Lama is our ambassador. He's one of the greatest goalkeepers in football history. His nickname was the Cat. I encourage you to look him up. That's an appropriate nickname for him. So obviously doing a lot in the partnership space. And one last word on that. You know, Harry yesterday mentioned that energy efficiency is half of the actions for the Paris Agreement. Investments in energy efficiency, though, are far lagging what the potential is for energy efficiency to help us to meet the Paris Agreement. So 2 weeks from today, we'll be in Copenhagen convening an energy efficiency charrette to bring together the finance community with the energy efficiency community and to try to get past that imbalance. Now, you know, I've talked about how, you know, through partnerships, the metal is making a positive impact on sustainable development. I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the actions that the industry is taking. You know, I could point to many case studies that our members are making. And forgive me, I wanted to go off script because this came across my Twitter feed about an hour ago. And it says, ICA members BHP, Rio Tinto, and Vale launched the Charge On Innovation Challenge to find solutions for charging technology to enable the electrification of mining vehicles. And apparently proposals received from more than 20 countries. You know, the electrifying of the mining sector is critical, and Scope 3 is obviously a big challenge. So congratulations to that group for taking a stand on Scope 3 emissions. You know, in terms of collective actions, in 2020 we launched something called the Copper Mark that ensures that copper is being produced responsibly. 31 criteria, an independent organization, and today about 20% of global copper production is certified through the Copper Mark. I know there's still 80% to go, but in 2 years I think quite a lot. You know, when it comes to decarbonization, you know, copper production accounts for 0.2% of agricultural emissions, and copper contributes to 2/3 of the solutions that will lead to decarbonization. But still, 0.2% may not sound like a lot. Maybe you could say it's just a drop in the ocean, but what is the ocean but a multitude of drops? So we're not ready to announce it today, but we are working on a decarbonization roadmap for the copper industry, so please stay tuned for that. We also recognize that the move towards a circular economy is critical, and we have designs to create a partnership that will work with governments to help them to put policies in place that will increase recycling rates. We'll also work with OEMs to design for sustainability. We heard from the fashion panel earlier just how important design for sustainability is. So we're doing our part on the SDGs through partnerships. We're doing our part to take care of our own house, so to speak, through responsible sourcing, decarbonization, and circularity. So with that in mind, and I mentioned this yesterday and I will repeat myself here, I think that there's a responsibility for governments to look at industries like mine more favorably. We are standing here willing partners to you. We have the solutions to help you to achieve your sustainable development goals to decarbonize. So, please work with us rather than working against us. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Steve. Yeah, do take a seat. I want to open this up now into a panel discussion. And very important, that last point you made, we talk about collaboration. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Sonja, I want to start with you, though. The Secretary-General brief focuses on transforming extractive industries for sustainable development. That's a quote. Why is it so timely for the UN to focus on extractive industries now?
I think it's quite important because the reality is the demand for certain minerals is definitely growing as we're accelerating the transition into the green economy. I mean, if you look at solar photovoltaic, if you look at wind farms, electric vehicles, the demands are really increasing for minerals. There was a scenario built by the IAEA, on what it would mean to transition and accelerate. And we saw that you needed 40% more of a demand, copper demand, 60 to 70% on lithium and nickel, and even 90% on lithium. So, it's really quite an increase in minerals when we move to these greener technologies, far more than the fossil fuel predecessors.
And what is the role, the role and the expectation of the UN system? We talked a little bit about this yesterday, but what is the role of the UN system in accelerating this shift to more sustainable, responsible mining? Tell us what the role is first, and tell us then whether you think the UN is fulfilling that role well enough.
The role is to ensure that as we act as the catalyst, as we spoke about yesterday, in getting to this cleaner energy transition in many forms, that we don't do it at the cost, the social cost and impacts of humanity. So the role is how to get that balance, which is an issue of policies, it's an issue of sharing knowledge, collaboration. So that's what I think the role is, because we don't want that in our rush to advance and get these technologies that we create, if I can say, new problems and new issues to the populations and societies where these minerals are being extracted.
Yeah, okay. Bruno, let me bring you in here, and I'm going to get to the standard on tailings management in just a second. But a broader comment from you, and I'd like the same from you too, John, in just a second. In terms of the sort of collaboration from private sector, policy, within the industry, across industry, how woefully short is it falling now, do you think?
Concretizing what Stephen has already said, so if we look at the amount of raw material that we have used, 50 years ago 30 gigatons, today 90 gigatons. In 50 years, 160 gigaton, 30, 90, 160. This is the basis, as Stephen said, it is the basis to create the world we want. It is the basis of the SDG implementation. So there is no way we will have to extract more material from the planet. On the other side, this extraction is producing more than half of the greenhouse gases impact. It is producing up to 80% of biodiversity losses. There is no way we continue in this way. So we are in the need of a sustainable mining industry and extractive industry. And when you see this needs to be implemented, to be realized in the next 50 years, what is nothing, this means that all actors have to work together.
Yeah.
The private sector has to take initiatives, the public space has to regulate it, the consumer has to make the adequate decisions when it comes to consumption.
But I guess my question is, how far have we come in terms of that collaboration? Well, we're clearly not seeing enough right now, but is it getting better? Since we last met 3-4 years ago in Nairobi, what has improved over those few years?
It's getting better. We are learning to work together. The game between private sector, public space, and consumer, it's working better. It is about having clearer vision, clearer understanding of the challenges and the potential solution, and it is about realizing the different roles that all these three parts I have in the game. It is not a confrontation between the public sector and the private space. It is a cooperation. It's a game of the parts, and this is we are getting better. Of course, we are far too slow.
No.
We will not get to the results in time if we not speed up.
I wonder sometimes, and John, I'm going to ask you in a similar question in a second, but I wonder whether sometimes a little bit of a confrontation is what is required, a little bit more naming and shaming to actually move this process on a little bit. Actually, John, before I come to you, Stephen, what do you think of that? Is that the wrong approach? Is that me with my journalist hat on trying to stir things up?
It's a fair question. I will say that I refer to ICA's members as the responsible stewards of the industry. We're the ones that are leading the charge on decarbonization, on responsible sourcing, on circularity, so that doesn't bother me at all when it comes to my members. Okay. But I think there is a role for that to push companies and industries along, sure. Someone said yesterday that there should be credentials to have a seat at the table, should be transparency. Yeah. And I support that, and my members support that, and we're getting there.
Okay, what do you think, John? I don't want to. You don't have to specifically answer the naming and shaming question, but the point that was made yesterday on credentials, transparency to get a seat at that table, I think maybe that's an important step.
Yeah, but I also think we should be conscious about that mining has a history with a lot of cowboys in it as well. It's been a bit of a free-for-all industry for a long time, and now that we're preparing for the sort of second super cycle for mining, because it's going to be a huge super cycle for mining companies now, we need to cleanse out the cowboys, and we need to have respectable, responsible people at the table who are prepared to do what we're doing with tailings, to set a global playing field, to get one regulatory framework, to cooperate with investors, with UNEP the way we've been doing. And it's time to grow up for the mining industry, basically.
But do you not, sorry to interrupt, do you not think what we've just mentioned, the need, the demand for transparency in order to get that seat at the table, do you not think that is enough to get these cowboys to work the way you need them to work?
I think looking at the mining industry, there's still a number of cowboys out there. And they really need to take a serious look at themselves in the mirror and decide who they want to be, because mining is moving really into the core center of everything when it comes to the transition. It's basically the new oil companies, and they're going to be scrutinized in a way they've never been scrutinized before. And we're living in a world with total transparency. Every mine site in the world will be scrutinized on all kinds of sustainability measurements, and they will need to stand up proud and be proud of what they're doing. And I think for many mining companies, that's a big challenge, to be honest.
John, you I guess, represent the investor perspective. You know, I mentioned here the Investor Mining and Tailings Safety Initiative, which you co-convene, I think I'm right in saying. Why, from an investor perspective, why is it important to green this sector and the tailing sector?
So I think unfortunately, and I'm not a big fan of divestment, on the contrary, I'm a true believer in engagement, but unfortunately, many responsible institutional investors have divested from the oil industry because of pressures onto climate. But that means they've moved into mining, and they're all expecting a super cycle. There's a huge expectation of a super cycle within mining, and there's going to be a super cycle within mining, a second super cycle again. Having said that, there's huge expectations on ESG. There's an ongoing discussion within the investment industry right now. Everybody's sort of become ESG aware the last few years, especially with Tesla skyrocketing.
Yeah. And are we allowed to use that acronym anymore, ESG?
Yeah,
especially with Tesla in mind.
Yeah, but I'm telling you, all of a sudden, and for me, having spent my life on this, I'm more than happy that we have this discussion. But having said that, there's, you know, the owners of the finance industry, you and I as individuals, we have a lot of expectations on the finance industry to take responsibility. So we can't leave the mining industry the way we've sort of left the oil industry. We have to engage. And once again, I think the pressures onto the mining industry is going to be huge. I think the copper mark that was raised by Stephen here is a perfect example. We're going to expect the sort of traceability through the value chain when it comes to green steel, copper, cobalt, all kind of minerals in a way we haven't seen before. And it's going to transform the mining industry in my world.
Yeah. Bruno, the global industry standard on tailings management, you're a big part of that. Just talk us through, you know, very, very briefly, some of the principles of the standard, what the challenges are in implementing it, and how you think we can move on from that.
The standard is one brick in that wall, in that building that we are constructing of a sustainable extractive industry. The objective it is to reduce, in the ambition to zero, the impact of tailings on human life and on the environment. The transformative elements of this standard are a number. On one side, we have, creating the standard, we have integrated technical knowledge, social knowledge, economical knowledge into one standard that looks in a comprehensive way at all these elements. At the same time, we have integrated the management of the tailings facilities into the general management of the mining site. For a long time, tailings were considered a kind of externality, something outside, that it is not fully under the control and responsibility of the mining side top leadership. In some cases, people working in these tailings were prevented to have a normal career then in the mining industry. So integrating this into the mining site was very important. And the third element of change, it was that the standard was developed in a co-creational way with the different stakeholder groups, investor on one side, community on the other sides, and the industry as a third part, creating together, finding compromises all the way through. It was not easy, but it was at the end, it produced a standard that was more or less accepted from the first moment and was implemented for the first moment. There are challenges. The standards far to be perfect. In implementing the standard into the practice will be challenging. We don't have enough technical people. We need an institution that have an eye on how the standard further develop and is implemented. But these are challenging in every sector that we have to take and to solve.
I saw you smiling, John. I know you want to come back on this one. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I think a key word, I'm totally for efficiency, but we need to talk about regulatory efficiency on a global basis. I think that's going to be a key word going forward. And back to the company comments on the great panel before us, there's too much noise, and we need to clarify expectations from the global community on every sector now. I think the cooperation we've done brilliantly with UNEP, with ICMM, to set this global standard that overrides all local standards or national standards. It's not perfect, but it sets the precedent for what we need to do in so many sectors and so many topics, because we're out of time. And people need to see results, otherwise they will lose trust in the processes that we represent. And I think this is a great example of what we can do when we cooperate together. So
yeah, I'm also being told in my ear that we're out of time, but there are a couple of other things I want to just get to you very, very quickly. Steve, in terms of technology, how far along are we in terms of being able to transition to a more circular economy in the mining industry?
You know, it's a challenge, especially for long life materials like copper, right? About 1/3 of demand today, copper demand, is met with recycled material. We would like to see that grow, and that's why we want to build a partnership to do that. The issue is that the lifetime for copper is typically 50 years, right? We're not going to disassemble buildings just to get at the wiring to feed that into the recycling loop, right? So it really comes down to policy, I think. You know, we just talked about how important it was to have a global regulation on tailings. You know, policy sets a level playing field, right? Yeah. Designing for sustainability, you know, I forget the number, it's 40 or 50 elements from the periodic table are in this phone. When this phone is done, how are we going to get those out of there? Yeah. It has to be economical, or it's not going to get done. So design for sustainability will at least make it more economical.
Let's get a final comment from each of you, a concluding thought, if you like, and maybe to prod you, we'll stay with the policy bit, because there seems to be a disgruntlement, you know, when it comes to talking about policy collaboration, policy support. I think I'm fair in saying that, Stephen. John, why don't you kick us off?
So I think finance can play an important role here, because once again, they're all trying to grapple with ESG and understanding the complexities of being responsible investors. And they will want that sort of global playing field. They will need sort of regulatory efficiency. And that will push countries to simplify, you know, the frameworks and the rule works. And you don't need to simplify them in a bad way. You can simplify them according to best practice. This is basically what we've been trying to do with the tailings standard. And we get a level playing field, and we need to push that process way ahead. And I think UNEP, the UN, these organizations that you see in front of it, is a perfect tool to get that done. So
okay, Sonja, let's hear your thoughts on that. Just on the back of what John's just said.
Yeah, well, you know, when John said the thing about cowboys earlier, I wanted to come back, because it really dawned on me that one thing we didn't talk about is the governance, the fragility of some of the governance societies and risks that we have in some of the areas where we have the extractives and the mineral actions taking place. And that's really a concern to us as we look at full sustainable development. So my final parting words is definitely we're going to be looking at the industries, the extractive industries and more to raise the bar higher. Good. Yeah, because at the end of the day, this is about people, planet, prosperity. Yep. And we ask for responsibility from supply chains, yep, to consumers, to communities, all levels of it. And, you know, I'm kind of thrilled to hear that there is a recognition of this, but yeah, we want more.
Yeah, but this bar raising needs to happen now,
yes,
right? It needed to happen yesterday.
Yes.
Okay, Bruno. Go ahead. Yeah.
It works,
yep,
yes. I will make a comment from a macroeconomic perspective. If you see the costs of commodities in our global GDP, the part of commodities in our GDP, it's a very small fraction. So 1% of the global GDP, maybe 2%, depends how you count. So even if in implementing a sustainable mining and sourcing policy, we double the cost. It's huge. We are not talking about this, but even doubling the cost, at the end of the day, in the price of this micro, in the price of these lights, in the price of our clothes, how much it will make? 0 point whatever. We will not even remark that that the change was made. But it will be a huge contribution in terms of stability of our system, in reducing the risk of our economy. The key is, as Sonia was saying, it is level playing field, supporting weak economies, weak governance system in keeping the same level globally on the planet, and we will get there.
Okay, very quick word, Steve.
Yeah, just a further word on the policy and the challenges, right?
And the disgruntlement.
Well, not disgruntlement. No. I support policy, and I think businesses want to understand what their expectations are. And when you have policies, it creates a level playing field, right? So the challenges are equal among companies. And it's important because just think about copper, and that's what I know about, I have to speak about. You know, our 30 members represent half of global production. There are 400 companies that report production, right? That means there's 370 roughly companies, more than 90% of the companies making up the other half. So policies are critical if you want to see action across that industry.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, look, I've got to stop it there, but and I appreciate the that we've had to cut this a little bit short, but fascinating insights from all of you. Sonja, thank you to you. Bruno, John, and Steve, thank you very much. We're going to take a very, very quick coffee break. I think it's going to be, grab a coffee, bring it back to the table. It's going to be about 10 minutes before we start the next session. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks.
Thank you, Axel.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back from the coffee break. We're going to get our next session started on sustainable procurement. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the session on accountability in public finance, fast-tracking sustainable public procurement, part of the Stockholm Plus 50 edition of the United Nations Science Policy Business Forum on the Environment. I'm Tim Nixon, Senior Advisor to the Science Policy Business Forum and CEO of Signal Climate Analytics. To provide a bit of context for today's discussion, public procurement represents up to 25% of global GDP. Governments can therefore have an enormous influence on creating markets for sustainable infrastructure and services. And the sooner they adopt policies on sustainable procurement, the sooner such services will grow and mature. In doing so, governments can boost jobs, growth, and investment to create an economy that is more innovative, resource efficient, and socially inclusive. There is already quite a lot happening in this space. A global study conducted by EcoVadis revealed that 97% of 120 supply chain professionals are already placing a higher level of performance on sustainable procurement than beforehand. European countries and the United States have put in place regulations that encourage sustainability of a company's operations. Examples of such regs are the Dodd-Frank Act on Conflict Minerals and the UK Environmental Liability Directive. Governments have the ability to shift markets by setting sustainable procurement policies. But sustainable procurement faces a number of challenges. Among them, the perception that sustainable products or services are more expensive, a lack of policy leadership, and therefore the legislation, policy commitments, and goals and corresponding implementation expertise. In a kind of chicken and egg situation, a lack of sustainable products and services to purchase to begin with. And finally, insufficient monitoring, evaluation, and/or enforcement of sustainable procurement policies. So joining us to discuss these challenges and opportunities today are Sebastian Postic, Project Manager, Industry, Energy, and Climate at 14CE. I invite the panelists to come up, please. Farid Yaker, Program Manager, Sustainable Public Procurement at the UN Environment Program. Paolo Magina, Head of the Public Procurement Unit at the OECD. Annie Stahlberg, Head of Sustainability Procurement at the Swedish National Agency for Public Procurement. And hopefully Pierre-Francois Taylor, I'm not sure he was in the building when we started, but if he is here, he's the co-founder and co-CEO of EcoVadis. And finally, from the White House, Carolyn Nguyen, Director for Private Sector Engagement and Global Public Sector Partnerships in the Council on Environmental Quality at the White House. So I'd like to thank you all for being here. And Carolyn, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you great. Thank you.
Excellent, excellent. So I'm going to start off with you. It's a little bit of a break from protocol up here, but we'd love to have you kind of kick us off. And my question for you is Carolyn, what is the U.S. approach to sustainable procurement, and what challenges have you seen in your engagements with other countries through the Greening Government Initiative?
Thanks, Tim. It's really great to be here. It's a pleasure to join you even virtually. Good morning, and thanks for convening this important conversation. Let me start, Tim, maybe by sharing the U.S. context that frames our approach to public procurement here in the United States. Under President Biden, there is an unprecedented effort underway here in the United States to tackle climate change at home. As part of that effort, the president specifically directed the federal government to lead by example for the reasons that you highlighted at the top, and to make its own operations more sustainable and to embrace its position as a leader and catalyst within the broader economy. This past December, the president set the first ever net zero emissions goal for the federal government and issued the most ambitious federal sustainability plan the United States has ever had. That federal sustainability plan calls on the government, for example, to electrify its fleet of over 600,000 cars and trucks by 2035. And
Carolyn, are you still with us?
yes, can you hear me?
Yep, you froze up there for a second. Rewind about 15 seconds and start again. Sustainable vehicles.
So I was talking about the sustainable the federal sustainability plan that talks about electrifying our fleet and also procuring, operating on 100% carbon-free electricity by 2030. That plan also set.
Carolyn, I'm afraid we've lost your audio again.
That plan also sets an ambitious path toward net zero emissions from federal procurement and sustainable federal supply chains by 2050. As some of you may know, the US government procures $650 billion worth of goods and services every year. We are the world's single largest purchaser of goods and services, and we know emissions of the federal supply chain are roughly double emissions from our vehicles and buildings combined. So against that context, our approach to sustainable public procurement really includes three elements. Namely, we think about what we buy, who we buy it from, and how we buy. With respect to what we buy, we focus on government-approved eco-labels and standards like Energy Star. And we work to identify and minimize products containing PFAS, the forever chemicals. There are experts in our agencies who assess eco-labels and standards and run statutorily mandated programs to certify facilities and products. So we know what to rely on when it comes to our government programs. On who we buy from, this relates to supplier disclosure. Companies are critical partners in the sustainable supply chain challenge. As part of our focus here, we will in the coming months propose a rule that would require major federal suppliers to publicly disclose their emissions. And for the largest of these suppliers, they will also be required to disclose their climate risks and set science-based targets to reduce those emissions. We know there's value in accountability and transparency. What gets measured gets managed, what gets disclosed gets acted upon. And so climate disclosure is going to be a critical aspect of doing business with the federal government. On how we buy, this includes, for example, integrating sustainability clauses into critical contracts, training procurement officials, and assessing how to apply the social cost of greenhouse gases into procurement. This also relates to the President's directive that we prioritize the purchase of lower carbon construction materials like concrete and steel, which are 8 to 10% of global emissions each, and we know public procurement drives the vast majority of purchases. So that's our approach. Now, there are, of course, challenges, and many of these are challenges that we know resonate more broadly, thanks to noting the Greening Government Initiative, or GGI. The United States government and the government of Canada at the moment are co-leading GGI, which is the first community of practice for government officials globally who are working to make their government operations more sustainable. It's fundamental to GGI is this idea of leading by example, and there are currently 41 countries that are formal participants in GGI, and there are a dozen or so additional countries that join our conversations. For many countries in GGI, green procurement is an area of great interest because really green procurement is foundational to every effort that governments undertake to green their sector. Whether a government is looking to make its transportation sector more sustainable, or its energy use, or its buildings, everything comes right back to procuring the right goods and services.
Carolyn?
Right, which is a good reminder that sustainable procurement is not just about reducing scope 3 emissions, it's also about scope 1 and scope 2.
Carolyn?
So Tim, if I could just...
Carolyn,
yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but we're running up a little bit against time here. So could I ask you to just to conclude your remarks, very important remarks, $650 billion a year in spending, Thank you for sharing with us. Could you just wrap up this part of it for us?
Yeah, so let me highlight just 3 quick challenges that we see globally and resonate with us. One is the fundamental question of what is a green product, right? There's so many products and there's so many product types that governments purchase. Our $650 billion goes from everything from milk to aerospace, tactical vehicles, vaccines. So it's not realistic, right, to have an eco label or products level analysis for all of them. But answering it's important for our procurement officials. The second challenge I would highlight is that what is the right training or expertise or tools that are necessary to infuse into the ecosystem so that we come out with the right procurement decisions, right, in this space. And the third challenge, just very quickly, is around the existence or lack thereof of political championship, strong directives, and mandates in this space. So let me pause there and turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's a terrific way to kick us off here with a emerging global leader in sustainable procurement. I want to switch now to Sebastian Postic, Project Manager for Industry, Energy, and Climate at I4C, I think right behind me here. Sebastian, you have great experience providing objective analysis of public spending at I4CE. You link that to government's performance against environmental targets, especially climate and the Paris Agreement. How much of an influence can sustainable public procurement be in the pursuit of global sustainability? And what are some of the things that governments could be doing better?
Thanks, Tom. And I'm glad Caroline ended just here because I think I'll pick up the baton just where she left it, talking about political championship and directives. Right now, where we are, states have good motivation to act, and the latest APCC report reminded us the little time we have left to move. They have more or less good targets, and the NDCs are getting better each year, and we have these long-term objectives already here. We see some reporting tools emerge, and I can go a bit deeper on that a bit later, reporting on state budget spending, reporting also on labels, as Caroline was mentioning. So both on the private and public side, tools emerge. What we don't have, or where we are stuck halfway probably, is a strategy, and a strategy for also a financing strategy and a public trajectory for how much money the public will put within the low carbon transition. An example for France, we know right now by the French low carbon strategy that the whole French economy should invest around 35% more than it's investing today in the low carbon transition. What we don't know is the share of the public in that. And that will depend on each country, but what we do need is for the state to step in and define their own strategy, which will be the baseline against which we can compare the efforts that Caroline was mentioning. How many of the 650 billion mentioned should actually go to green purchase and green procurement? What should be this green procurement? What are the targets for each sector described from paper to space navigation? What are the specific sectoral targets for each sector? Once you have once you have the right labels, it's something, or the right discussion or training with the both within the public sector and the private partners, it's something. Having this reporting tool, it's also something, but at some point you have to compare them to a strategy that is ambitious enough. And that's something that we're working hard right now at I4C to help countries define and embark. Something that has not been done so much so far is really embarking finance ministries in this exercise. We have very good technical exercises by environment ministries, but we really need much more detailed explanations and implications of the public share of actions within these strategies. I think I will cut here for you to catch up a bit with your delay and leave some time for the next presenter.
Okay, thank you very much, Sebastian. We'll come back to your comments at the end of the panel, but I'd like to move on now to talk about Sustainable Development Goal 12, which is focused on ensuring sustainable consumption and production patterns. So I'd like to invite Farid Yakar, Program Manager of Sustainable Public Procurement at the UN Environment Program, to tell us what the latest data is on member states in terms of public procurement in relation to SDG 12. And can you please tell us also about what's required to improve performance in the area of public procurement in terms of transparency and accountability?
Thank you, Tim.
Sure.
Well, we have an issue of measurement of sustainable procurement. So far, even in developed countries, we don't know how many products, services, and works are purchased. We have dollars, but we have aggregated figures, but we don't have the units. And if we don't have the units, then we don't know the sustainability impacts. We have no idea to what extent procurement is green, so basically we're in the fog. UNEP is the custodian of SDG 12.7, which is measuring the progress of SPP at global level. So we have developed an index, but we can only measure process indicators and not outputs, let alone the outcomes of SPP in terms of GHG emission reductions, green jobs created, etc. And this comes back to, if you were yesterday here, to what Professor Ekins was saying. We have great technologies, but we're not using them really to give us the information on how sustainable, how environment is damaging for the moment the environment, and we don't know to what extent public procurement is green or not. So what we're advocating is to use AI, big data, quantum computing to better assess public procurement and its sustainability impacts. We should be able to assess the environmental and social footprints of procurement portfolios in order to get a baseline against which we will plan sustainable procurement and we will try to achieve targets. And this is helpful also to prioritize our work. We cannot work on all categories, as Caroline was saying. We have to work on high impact categories to develop specific SPP guidelines for these categories. For example, energy efficient appliances, we know there is high impact, green electricity, etc. So UNDP and UNEP have developed a tool which measures the risk exposure of procurement portfolios based on sustainability risks of these categories and on the volumes of procurement. We need, however, the support of digital technologies to fine-tune the ratings. We need also to automate due diligence processes, to overcome resource limitations. Using bots and machine reading, it is possible to review media, social media, for indications of perpetrators of environmental or social violations in almost real time. And to come back to the question of prices, we need to bring down the prices of green options and alternative options. Green fiscal support to green alternatives have to be provided. We have to remove harmful subsidies. Rana was telling us yesterday how enormous these subsidies are. And we have to send strong and consistent demand signals to the market. This means we have to pool private and public procurement and harmonize the purchasing criteria, for example, through eco-labels, as was said earlier, with the objective of achieving the SDGs. This will in turn lead to higher investments, supply increase, and price reduction, and we have seen that, for example, for paper, for medical gloves, etc., prices come down when we have higher volumes. And finally, I will conclude. We have to bring together institutional purchasers, private, public, because they are uniquely positioned to demand transparency into the upstream and downstream impacts of goods and services, and they are capable of incorporating sustainability criteria into purchasing decisions and send consistent signals to the market at a scale that can be transformative. And last two items are the right legal frameworks, mandatory procurement, value for money in developing countries, allow life cycle costing to factor in negative externalities like GHG emissions, support procurers to capacity building information, and digitalize e-procurement platforms that are much more conducive to SPP and they help monitor SPP. So the focus should be on developing effective implementation versus advocating SPP. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Farid. I think you may have planted a seed here for a session on big data and procurement. So thank you.
I tried to ask a question, but we didn't have to.
Thank you for that. It's very interesting. So I want to switch over now to Paolo Magina, head of the Public Procurement Unit at OECD. Paolo, what from your experience, and how would you rate the level of accountability in public procurement across nations? And what are some of the ways that accountability can be increased, and increased rapidly?
Tim, we saw throughout the pandemic many governments put additional efforts to demonstrate how the spending was going. All OECD countries are using procurement in a strategic way. We have seen that for many years now. We are supporting the countries in achieving these goals. But coming to measurement, I would like to come back to what Farid said. It's not just about the goal 12.7. As you know, procurement is probably responsible for achieving 82% of SDGs. There is a study coming from the Nordic Council last year that demonstrates that procurement is tightly connected with 82% of SDGs. So we have a role to play. You also said that, as we know, procurement is 12% of GDP in OECD countries. So it's the single most important activity that the government can conduct that impacts the economy, that impacts the consumption and production patterns. So we do have a role, and I believe most of our countries at the OECD area at least recognize this role and this importance, and they are coming up with new measurement frameworks. And I would like to come to this sentence that we always use, that we don't know what we don't measure. And I was talking to Canada the other day, and they came up with a different perspective. They said, what we choose to measure is a statement of what we value. We cannot continue saying that we are so keen into sustainability and we are unable to measure the impact of the sustainable decisions we are making and the procurement strategies that we are choosing. So it's very important that we are able to produce indicator frameworks that are relevant, that we can include them in the e-procurement systems that most countries have developed, and that we are able to measure the impact of these strategies in terms of concrete indicators, carbon reduction, other indicators that are relevant for sustainability, not just on the green dimension, but also on the social. So from our side, we are coming up with this indicator framework that we will present to countries later this year, that will allow them to choose which indicators are relevant for their own purpose and policy nature. But on top of that, we need to come up with this coordination and comprehensive analysis. And I'm glad to have Caroline on this panel, because we are coordinating with the governments of the US and Canada and other OECD countries to come up with, the tools are there, you know, the tools exist. We don't need more regulations, we don't need more legal frameworks, we just need more implementation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paolo. I like that we measure what we value. That's a good one. So I'd like to switch now to a national and local take on the issue. And Annie Stahlberg is head of sustainability procurement at the Swedish National Agency for Public Procurement. Annie, how long has Sweden had a policy on sustainable procurement, and what has the experience been? And maybe to add to that, what have been the successes and challenges, and could you have any advice for other countries moving into this space more initially?
Yes, and I think Sweden have been working with this for a very long time. We had our first action plan in 2007, and already in the 90s or in 2001, we had started a national support on green public procurement. So we have been having support for a very long time. We also had a new action plan on public procurement, 2016, with 7 policy objectives for healthy businesses. And we continued with a new procurement law, 2017, and mandatory laws on labor condition. And now we're moving forward with a new proposed law on how to make it mandatory to take environmental conditions into account when procuring. So we have had a long history of actions and have been working within this field for a long time. The success is, of course, that it's essential to have an action plan. It's really important to point out the direction, and important in order to reach the politicians, and if you reach the politicians, you can have it a strategic manner throughout the organization. We have had that, but on the other side, I fully agree with Farid on the challenges. For example, in our action plan, we don't have clear goals because we don't know where we are, and that is a clear challenge. We don't know what the outcome is in the end. We can see, yes, they use green public procurement or sustainable public procurement. They do it. We can ask them, but we don't know the output, and that is really something that we are trying to move forward towards. But it's really important. It's really complicated, and this has been discussed within the EU as long as I've been involved in the last 15 years, for sure. So it is a challenge. In Sweden, we also have some challenges connected to a decentralized public procurement. Our different regions and different parts of Sweden make their own decisions, and that could be a challenge for the state to decide. So, but on the other hand, the success in Sweden has come from that we have had this national support function for a very long time, for many years, and that we have been able to support, have support focused on what our customers actually want. We also, it's important to support in the whole procurement process. The greatest leaps are possible to make in the earlier stages, and that's really important to have support, to give support to the procurers, or to the organizations, I should say, in order to build the organization so they can handle sustainable public procurement. And it's also very important with broad stakeholder involvement in order to reach out and have this connection with the suppliers, of course. Yeah, I would say, and other countries, and how should we we are cooperating a lot with other countries. For example, Norway is a very close collaboration partner, and we are helping each other, give and take all the time. They use our criteria database. We use other things from them, and we are doing this together all the time. And also the other Nordic countries, we have a really close collaboration.
I wonder, Annie, maybe you could just share in 30 seconds, if you can. There's a perception that sustainable procurement might be more expensive. What's your experience? How do you think about cost in terms of moving towards sustainable procurement?
Yeah, of course it could be more expensive, but we have done some studies on this and have actually seen that if you make the procurement more strategic, then you can actually lower your cost in the long run. And it comes up with both life cycle costing, of course, but also if you have a strategic manner, then you can choose and you don't have to buy something really late and really expensive, and then you can actually lower the cost in the long run. So if you have a strategic manner, then you can lower the cost and you can be sustainable.
And of course, part of that goes back to measurement, right? Can you measure those costs? So, all right, so on the topic of measurement, here we go, Pierre-François, co-founder and co-CEO of EcoVadis, which is a pioneer when it comes to business sustainability ratings, having ratings on more than 90,000 companies. So what's your experience, Pierre, so far on the applicability of using sustainability ratings in procurement contexts? Why are they important? What do they not do? Please share.
Okay, thanks for inviting me first. I will start by a disclaimer. I'm not an expert in public procurement. I'm an expert in private procurement or sustainable private procurement. But I want to share with you the perspective of things which are happening now in the private sector, which can be hopefully giving ideas or giving good insights for what could be done in the public sector. So EcoVadis, we are the leader in sustainability rating for supply chain. We were created 15 years ago. We are celebrating now our 15th anniversary, not the 50th like UNEP. But from day one, we set up a vision, which is you need to have a measurement, you need to have a metric allowing buyers to understand the sustainability performance of their suppliers to influence their decisions. And our definition of sustainable procurement is it's buying sustainable products from responsible suppliers. It's what you buy and who you buy from. It's you have of course the green characteristics of the seat of the chairs you're sitting on, but what about the sustainability of the vendor? What about their social practices? What's happening in their supply chain? So we're looking at the supplier side. And indeed, for this, we created these ratings. To give you some numbers, indeed, we are rating 90,000 businesses across 150 countries. We are now more than 1,200 employees worldwide. And one of the metrics which is the most important for us is the spend we influence. So we work with 1,000 mainly private organizations, which are using our ratings to assess their suppliers. And those 1,000 organizations, they represent roughly 3,000 billions of annual spend, $3 trillion, and we influence roughly half of that. So it's equivalent to the GDP of a large country. And indeed, we've seen providing ratings on suppliers in a way which can be highly standardized, applicable throughout all spend categories, applicable throughout all countries. It's providing a scalable way for buyers to decide which suppliers they want to work with. One thing we've seen in the private sector is a huge acceleration in the past 2 or 3 years. And I don't know if we see the same acceleration in sustainable public procurement, but for the private sector, it's been quite slow for the first 10 years. And indeed, there was a real uptick 2 or 3 years ago. EcoVadis today, we are growing more than 50% year over year, so it's an indication of the adoption. And I think Farid was talking about the need to have metrics and measuring sustainable procurement performance, not only from an output or not only from process perspective, but from an output perspective. So on the vendor side, on the supplier side, indeed, we can have an output measurement, which is, if you work with 1,000 buyers, 1,000 suppliers, what percentage of your suppliers have high sustainability credentials? What percentage of your suppliers have committed to decarbonize their operations within X years? So we can really measure the performance of suppliers. Measuring performance of products, that's a different topic. That's more complicated, as you know. But on who you buy from, if you want to measure the performance of a public procurement organization in terms of the performance of their portfolio, indeed you have tools now, and using AI and big data, which we do, we can do it in a scalable way. Maybe one comment on regulations. You are saying we don't need more regulations. You have a complete framework already. I agree with that, maybe with the exception of the public procurement code and what we've been told by public procurement buyers we've been working with. You have a constraint in the EU Public Procurement Code on the fact that you can only take into account CSR elements which are linked to the product you buy, not to the performance of the vendor. And that's different in the private sector. In the private sector, they are also taking into account the performance of the vendor, not only the performance of the product, which create this cascade effect. And I think this could be applicable to public procurement in some way.
Thanks very much, Pierre-François. We have just a couple minutes left, but before maybe going out to the floor for questions, I'd like to give the panelists, and Carolyn, you've heard all of the panelists speak now, so I'd like to give everybody a chance to comment, if you'd like to, on what your panelists have said. Carolyn, did you want to have anything additional to add based on what you've heard from the panelists?
You know, I agree with, and it's interesting to hear the diversity of perspectives here and agree largely with what's been said. I wanted to touch in particular and follow up on the political mandate piece, the regulatory mandate and the ecosystem piece in particular. We've talked a little bit about the importance, right, of having clear mandates here. And one thought and one observation here from my perspective within GGI and the US government is that there's real value, right, in having, when governments really embrace their role of being a catalyst in the broader economy. Because when governments embrace that they are a sector within the economy that also needs to reach net zero, that in a way presents a tangible, right, and measurable also kind of target that underpins or frames the rest of the effort. We talked earlier about how you can't get to net zero in the public sector without sustainable procurement, how it affects scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. And so one thought is, you know, if more governments are also being explicit of their role as a sector and part of the NDC of reaching net zero themselves, then that creates maybe a foundation and mandate, right, for broader momentum on procurements as well.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Any other quick burning comments from the panelists?
No, just to give you the results of the first data collection exercise for 12.7. We conducted that last year. We have 40 countries participating, one of them being Sweden, representing 72% of global GDP, which is $11 trillion. We have 33 countries complying. Most of them come from Europe, but we have good participation from Asia, and of course we have Canada, US, and a good number of countries in Latin America. Problem in Africa where we need to have more participation, more green public procurement. Next data collection exercise is this year. We have much more participation in terms of number of countries that are ready to participate. We have about 80 countries, so we're hopeful that, you know, in the end we'll have maybe 60 countries participating. So we can feel there's a strong movement within governments to support sustainable procurement. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fareed. Anybody else? Axel, do we have time for a question or two? Or? Great. Anybody from the floor, would you like to ask a question? Yes, back in the middle there, please.
Yeah, thank you for your explanation. And as I understand, there is a movement regarding the public procurement, but Sebastian mentioned the greening the budget of the state. Is there the same movement at the international level? It means there are a lot of countries who use a methodology of evaluating the greening, how the public finance are green or not in the world, or who are the leader, and if you can tell us more about this movement.
Sebastian, if that's a comment for you to start with.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's something that is expanding, and that's something, I think it's Annie who said we cannot know where we want to go if we don't know where we are now. And this part of reporting on the state spending is really important. I mean, it's exactly the same that states ask from their vendors in the end, being accountable of what they're doing. And that's something that has been expanding. I think Fareed mentioned, or Paulo, I don't remember, the post-COVID recovery plans. That's something that has been really a strong demand post-COVID. So many countries adopted reporting schemes for their budgets and assessing how green their budget is after the COVID. One thing that's still missing is that in many cases we know how much money is spent toward green goals. In some cases, we know how much money is spent with green impacts and also with harmful impacts. What we usually don't know in this kind of exercises is how efficient is this spending and how far it is. What's the gap between the spending and the strategy? And that's come back to the point I had before. In these cases where we have these kind of assessment exercises, we don't have the counterfactual point to say, okay, we spend this much, but this is not efficient, or we spend this much and we are so far from where we should be. That's something that's really missing, because in many cases, the strategy is not here. I don't know since you're in Stockholm, I'm not, but I hope you're enjoying your stay here, and I will have maybe a go at the maritime analogy. We're like, right now, states are like boats. They know where they should go. They recently learned that they should go very fast to arrive before the storm. We have these kind of exercises that are like GPS points. We also have some tools that emerge that are kind of maps. We know where are the good waters, where are the shallows, where are the islands, but we don't know how to sail that. And that's something that's really missing so far. Short-term goals, short-term detailed strategic commitments and directions for finance ministries. And that's really something that we should insist upon. Otherwise, the reporting is nearly useless.
Thank you very much. Any other comments on that?
Yeah. Yep. If I may comment on this. Yes, we saw when we asked the countries how they were planning to deal with the recovery phase, we saw many countries linking the recovery plans with environmental and climate change objectives. More than 60% of OECD countries are doing so. And also some of them are linking it to social dimensions such as gender, minority, and so on, although less than we would expect. Around 40% of the countries were looking at these dimensions and linking them to infrastructure plans. But I wanted to stress that the pressure will be very high on public procurement officials and professionals to deliver on all these strategic objectives. So we do need to come up with training strategies, with more competency frameworks, with certification schemes that we see them happening in many countries. But these strategies need to be linked to the strategic dimension of procurement. Maybe some of you heard my colleague yesterday talking about the well-being budget in some OECD countries. We see this coming up also on procurement. Procurement is a strategic tool that is put at the center of delivering broader outcome strategies, for instance, in the case of New Zealand. But even when they look at procurement as a tool to deliver on broader outcomes, and they have plenty of objectives there, they are unable to measure them. So the measurement frameworks are lagging behind, and we need to come up with better measurement frameworks that can precisely demonstrate the impact of procurement into the economy. And we are doing so. We did it in Finland, in Chile, in New Zealand, and we are now doing it in Ireland as well. And I would welcome more countries to join this work. Thank you.
Great. I'm told we have time for just one more question. Anybody else? Yes, question please.
Thank you. My name is Kaisar Nawab. I'm representing Islamic Republic of Pakistan and also the youth of Pakistan as well. So my question is from the State Department representative, Madam. The question is like, what extent the United States foreign policy is conducive to protection of environment and the global dignity? Thank you.
I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part of the question?
Yes, like what extent U.S. foreign policy is conducive to protection of environment and global dignity?
And global dignity.
Environment and global dignity.
Well, environment and global dignity. So to what extent is the U.S. policy protecting of the environment and global dignity with respect to public procurement?
Yeah, so I can comment maybe broadly on this, which is, part of the objective here on procurement is to ensure and support sustainable federal supply chains, right, by 2050. And so our federal supply chains do have international dimensions. And so part of the effort here of working with major suppliers, regardless of where they may be, right, and looking at their disclosures and climate risks, and for the very major suppliers also ensuring that they set validated science-based targets, there would be international implications as well, as we understand that our supply chains also reach globally.
Thanks very much, Carolyn. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I'd like to thank the panelists for your valuable contributions. The recommendations from the panel will be fed into the UN Environment Assembly. Let's give the panelists a hand, please. Nicely done. Yeah.
All right. We come to our final session before lunch, and it's a big one. The next climate COP, From Pledges to Action is its title. Of course, Glasgow last year witnessed the formation of new private sector and finance alliances and initiatives that promise to create positive transitions toward meeting the Paris Agreement targets. There's no doubt that there must be a deep transformation of the world's economy, and the private sector needs to play a big part in that. Private finance can help fund private sector initiatives and turn billions committed to climate investment through public channels into trillions of total climate investment. But unlocking systemic change does require collaboration, ambitious commitment, and near-term action across the entire financial system. So in this session, we're going to review progress made by some of the leading private sector entities and alliances to understand whether we're ready to show progress as we approach the next climate COP in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, of course. Right, so let me get the panelists up on stage. We've got two joining us remotely. I'll mention those first. Irene Feiger is Head of Climate Strategy and Circular Economy at BMW Group. Dr. Li Zhang is Director, Green Inclusion and Carbon Neutrality Center, joining us from China. And then here with us, Annika Ramsköld, Head of Sustainability at Vattenfall. Welcome, Annika. Take a seat wherever you like. Nina Ekelund is Executive Director at the Haga Initiative. Come on up, Nina. And Vanessa Butani is Vice President Sustainability at Electrolux. A warm welcome to all of you. Look, we've got our work cut out for us. I am going to kick it off with Irene at BMW. And it's a question I ask a lot of the corporates. And in fact, I put it to your CEO, Oliver Sipser, last year. And that is this balance that you need to find between a responsibility to shareholders and your stewardship of the planet. How difficult is it to find that balance, and is it getting any easier, Irene?
I think it's very important that you take into account the most important and large aspects where you save CO2 at the lowest cost, right? That's why we do an abatement curve for everything we do. So we look into each aspect of our supply chain, for example, and we take into target those things where we can achieve the most CO2 reduction at the lowest possible cost. To your question whether it's getting easier, I think it's definitely getting easier in terms of the technology, and the innovation is going into CO2 reduction measures as our suppliers actually see and realize that it's very important for us to reduce CO2. So next to quality and price, is the CO2 that is associated with a certain material, we take that into account when we choose for a supplier. And as they know that there is a lot of investment in the steel industry, in the plastic industry, etc., going into CO2 abatement techniques. And that's why I think it's going to get easier in terms of innovation. But of course, marginal costs for reducing CO2 increase. So the lower you go, a 10% reduction at a much later stage is going to be more expensive.
Yeah, okay.
So there are two sides to it.
All right, Irene. And look, I'll come on to the actions that BMW, the specific actions that BMW is taking in just a moment. But a similar question to the other two corporates here, Electrolux and Vattenfall. You know, this idea of finding that balance between, I guess, you know, maybe this is the wrong way of putting it, but a fiduciary duty to your clients and your shareholders, and your conscience, your stewardship of the planet. How hard, let me ask you, Vanessa, yes, Vanessa, right? How hard do you find that?
I think that's a big question, but I think
with the risk of sounding far too corporate here, I mean, what we're really trying to do is integrate this into our business strategy, right? So there is no difference. So we have to do this because that's the right way for us to do business going forward, because we see, right, our customers, retailers, we're a major appliance manufacturer, right? They're asking us for this. They're asking us to share with them, what are we doing, how are we doing? Consumers are asking us for this all the time. So it's not like two separate questions. It has to be together, and we have to put it together.
And I agree, and I hear that from a number of corporates. I guess the question has to be, how successful are you being in bringing those two things together, in making them one? How realistic a proposition is that really?
Yeah. Again, good question. I think I was sitting in discussions this morning about looking at recycled steel, green steel, recycled plastics. How are we going to get even more of that into our products? And it's all about getting it right from the design so that we can get the business case to work. And that's what it's all about. But the business case can't just be also looking at simply the financials. As Irene was saying, we need to be looking at putting in even more. What is the cost of carbon, and how is that going to impact our business case? If I look at other areas where we're looking at in terms of energy and replacing really high energy processes that we have, and I'm sure you share that with BMW also, that it's really tough, and those business cases, to get that together, it's still very expensive to change those processes.
Yep.
So it's a constant discussion.
Annika, how is it getting easier to, and maybe this is the wrong way of putting it as well, but is it getting easier to tell big institutional investors, if you don't like what we're doing, you don't have to invest in our company?
I'm not sure that it gets, that's also a tricky question, but I think investors start realizing the same that we have realized, that, I mean, also like Vanessa says, we need to listen to all the stakeholders externally, regardless of whether it's customers or suppliers or others, and we need to ensure that we are in tune with the expectations. And it's very clear that we need to be at the edge of doing that, and for Vattenfall, we know that we need to be part of enabling the fossil-free living within a generation, and we just need to decarbonize. And I think the way to do that is, if we don't act here and now, I mean, you can say that it's challenging to be an early mover, but it would even be devastating to not do the steps that are needed. And I think that's something that the investors also see these days. So no, I don't think it's becoming much more almost a prerequisite. You need to be tuned in to have a sustainable business model also for the future.
Yeah, and Nina, just a comment from you generally on this, from a Nordic perspective, and what businesses in this region are doing and how successful they're being. Do you think there has been a successful shift, and do you think it's supported from the policy side? Yeah, go ahead, Nina. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. It has been successful in Sweden, and just to mention a number, we have been looking at the companies, the 100 largest companies in the stock market, and we asked how many of you are halving your emission to 2030. So 2 years ago, 1 out of 5 companies were halving their emissions to 2030. That's quite ambitious. The year after, it was 1 of 3 companies halving their emission, and this is the big companies in Sweden. So, and then you also have to do it and follow up and do the measures. But we can see that some companies are able to do the change and be forerunners in the climate transformation. It's possible for them. Most of the companies have to struggle. And what we need to do is to have the dance with policy. It won't work if we don't get the right price on carbon, as Vanessa mentioned. We need the right price, because today it's cheap and we don't have a sufficient right price. And we also have extremely big subsidies. So we need policy on board.
It's a nice, Annika, I will come to you in just a sec. It's a nice way to put it, a dance with policy rather than a tussle or a fight, right?
I don't think we should fight, because it's better to dance with them.
Absolutely right. Annika, go ahead.
No, I wanted to say I had the privilege of being at COP in Glasgow, and I think just to say, you asked whether Scandinavian companies are sort of showcasing and going ahead. And there we had the chance to showcase in the Swedish pavilion that we are able to make full value chains that are fossil-free. So we show that all the way from the mine with LKAB, and then via the steel production using fossil-free electricity to make the hydrogen, then produce the fossil-free steel, sell it to Volvo Group. They make a vehicle. That vehicle is deployed by the construction company Skanska.
Yep.
So it's not only, it's all these type of collaborations, not only individual sort of lighthouse projects, but really building full value chains.
You know, now you've said that, you know I've got to ask you whether you're selling this stuff to BMW yet.
Well, we are not the ones selling.
Okay.
We're part of the joint venture.
Okay.
It's SSAB that is the one
I'll ask
that actually
Irene in a second. All right, Li Jiang, let me bring you in here. I mean, you've heard what the speakers have said so far. You know, with Glasgow in the rearview mirror and Sharm el-Sheikh coming up, how optimistic do you feel generally?
I think the most important thing is whether the consumers will pay the bill to purchase those good products with low carbon emission. And according to the IPCC's recent report, the average household consumption carbon emission accounts for about 72% of total carbon emission globally. A Chinese Academy of Sciences report points out that China carbon consumption side, China's consumption side, including industrial products and the household consumption, has accounted for about 53% of total carbon emission. So the carbon reduction from the consumption side constitutes a serious challenge. I think it's not only the producer can make good products with low carbon emission, but also the consumers, they need to pay the bill and they need to consider how to choose more less carbon emission products.
And how supportive is government in this? How supportive is the private sector in this when it comes to choices the consumer is making? To what degree are they being led correctly in your view?
Yeah, as you know that, climate challenges in China is really a big challenge to the Chinese government as well as business sectors. And at the COP26 last year, the parties bridged the differences and broadened consensus to reach the implementation roles of Paris Agreement, including drawing up some important document. But it seems that a global effort to tackle climate change has not yet succeeded. And in China, energy use is still dominated by fossil fuel in China, and the contribution of new energy sources is not very promising yet. So I think with China's rapid social economy development in the past 40 years, carbon emissions from the production side have remained high. So we need more commitment and actions from not only the public governmental policy side, but also all the forces from the different sectors, including the private sector, the public sector, civil society as well.
Yep, okay. Irene, let me quickly come back to you on this clean steel question. Is BMW using it?
Yes, we are buying green steel. We are buying all different kinds of green steel. But I would like to refer to a question on price and who is going to pay for it. I think it's very important to differentiate between what price do they pay in terms of compared to what. What Nina has said before on the CO2 price, I think is a prerequisite for green steel to come into the market, like expensive green steel, like hydrogen-based steel. Because if there is no CO2 price that the industry needs to pay, it's going to be very hard to factor in hydrogen-based steel at big scale. So I think the prerequisite in order to have these large industrial processes decarbonized, you need to have a CO2 price for all the industries for heavy industries, for example, which is in Europe, most of them don't pay the CO2 price.
Yeah.
So I think that's a very important point.
And on a carbon price, I mean, what do you make of the progress so far, or lack of progress, some might say?
Pardon, I
on the
didn't
carbon price, CO2 price?
What the price is?
Yeah, no, what it is, yes, but and also the huge disparities in price globally, but how successfully it's being implemented and used.
We started in 1990 in the Nordics, 91 in Sweden, and the Finnish were like a few months before us with the carbon tax. So we had it for a long time, and we can really see, and maybe Vattenfall can mention what the outcome is. We can see that it really had lowered the emission, especially in the energy sector. So we can really see it's been positive. And then we got to EU ETS, and that's a carbon price also. And that has been very, very successful, looking at all the companies in the industry and energy sector in the EU ETS, emission trade scheme. So that has been successful as well. So the combination of the carbon tax and EU ETS has been fantastic to move business. So now, I would say, Nordic businesses are prepared for the climate transformation and have lowered their emission and energy costs. So, and that is also good from a competitive perspective, because I think we stay quite strong.
Irene, I'm going to come back to you, and it's a question I'm going to then put to Vattenfall and Electrolux as well. You know, when it comes to targets, net zero targets, 2030, 2040, 2050, I think what concerns a lot of people, and concerns me when I speak to the leaders of these companies, is the short term. You know, what happens over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years? And you know, with all due respect, the auto manufacturers come out with new electric models and big targets that will get them to hit peak emissions and then get them to bend the curve down over the next 20 years. But how short-term focused are you and do you need to be?
So we have very clear near-term targets. We have targets for 2030 for all our scopes. And these targets are monitored every year. And they are not only monitored, but there's a very clear consequence if the targets are not met. And these consequences that the payment of the board in part depends, so the benefits depend in part on the sustainability measures. So CO2 for the scopes, those targets are a part of how the board and top management gets compensated. So I think that's a very, very effective measure to take. Yep. And it's monitored every year.
Has BMW hit peak emissions?
Yes.
You have hit peak emissions. So yes. You're on your way down. This curve is bending down from now on. Okay. Yes. Same question to Vattenfall and Electrolux. Irene talks about 2030 as short term. Is it short term enough? I mean, what happens over the next 8 years? You know, what about year 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6?
Well, first of all, I want to say, from Vattenfall's side, we've started to act already. So, I mean, we set a target to keep ourselves within 2 degrees warming back in 2019, and already, and that was compared to the baseline 2017. Already 2020, we had fulfilled the target for 2030. So we had cut our emissions in own activities by more than 40%. So we doubled those ambitions, and now we have a target fully in line with 1.5 degrees, and also net zero in the full value chain by 2040. And of course, we measure every year the progress. And I'm happy to say that every single year we see clear reductions in our own activities, but definitely we work a lot in the supply chain, and also there we have clear targets measured year by year that we are reducing also from supply chains, and definitely support our customers to do the same.
Yeah. I mean, it's admirable, Vanessa, but it's clearly not enough when you look at the science. The IPCC report, 1.5 degrees, it's not enough. We're not going to get there on time, right? That must be the constant reminder in your minds, on your consciences, when you make these business decisions.
Definitely, and I think to echo a little bit what we've heard from colleagues is, I mean, it's great that we set the targets, the long-term targets, and we set the short-term targets, and it's really about the motivation. How do you get people to move, right? And for us, that really has been a few things, and one of them is looking at, well, if we tie this to their salary, then that's going to happen. So 850 of our managers in the company now have their long-term bonus plan tied specifically to the carbon reduction, and we're seeing really action happening from that because we're hitting, sorry, but where it hurts, right? And I think that also helps everybody to see, this is how I can make an impact, this is how I can participate, and I think that's very important. Yep. Then we've also got green financing that we work with as well, which forces us as a company to keep on our toes, to keep reporting what we're doing. So all these things, I mean, of course, we've set science-based targets. We were one of the first companies, first 100 to do so. We're following up on that, we're reporting on that, but really it's about how do you motivate the people to actually make the change? And we found certain ways to do that.
Okay, yeah, no, that's 850 people. I mean, yeah, Nina, go ahead.
Just a comment, it's so important to follow up and do the daily work. In the business network that I run, the Haga Initiative, it started 12 years ago, and then we had a target, 40% reduction until 2020. The companies succeeded it with 80% reduction, 70% reduction, and the new target is net zero emission until 2030, and at least we need to halve the emission because the UNEP report said we need to five-fold the ambitions to stay below 1.5 degrees in the world. So, and the daily work that Annika told us about that you need to follow up every year is so important. But the big challenge for the companies right now is how to handle scope 3, the value chain. And that means we need new business models, and we need to think, because before it was about the company's own work. Now it is about business to business, business to consumer. Yep. It's about the business strategy. It's so much harder, but it will affect everyone, because when these big companies say that they want to have a net zero or half their emissions, that means that other companies need to step up.
Yep. Go ahead, Annika.
No, and I wanted to build on that because we are at Vattenfall embarking on a number of exciting partnerships exactly in order to tackle the scope 3 emissions. So it's really about aligning with those that are producing the steel, like the hybrid case or the cement, that both key components when we build a lot of new wind farms. But it's also through this first movers coalition. And I think this is, if we start talking about the scope 3 and to tackle emissions from suppliers, here we need to show investors and those that are producing these breakthrough technologies that there is a clear demand for these technologies. And here I think First Movers Coalition is an excellent example. A number of companies, and Vattenfall was one of the founding members there, we collectively tell the manufacturers that this is how much collective power we have, and we are asking for these completely breakthrough technologies and gather that.
Lee, I'll come back to you in just a second, but I'm, on this point, I do want to put it to the three corporates. Do you have examples in which you've told suppliers you're not going to do business with them because they're not clean enough?
I can start off by saying the first step is to say that we put requirements when we buy things, and we ask for innovative solutions. We want to see that they are using recycled material or fossil-free materials. And then, so that was the first step, to start putting these requirements.
And it's followed strictly, this,
and it's followed. In the very beginning, and here I think we need to be frank, when we started to post these requirements, let's say 5 years ago, a lot of the suppliers would say, no, we don't have that, or it's too costly, and are you willing to pay for all of that? But by starting to ask for it, and then start looking at which of the suppliers are willing to try to walk down that road and actually offer these things, that's when you start getting them on board. And now we have a number of examples where we have put these sharp requirements. They are much lower, and the interesting thing, if I refer to the previous panel, there you were discussing how much more expensive is it. The interesting thing is that we were prepared that it would be more expensive, but it's on par or sometimes even lower, because you recycle material, you do use resources in a more efficient way.
Irene, how bold is BMW when it comes to telling suppliers in no uncertain terms they're not clean enough?
We have a very clear three-step process. The first thing is we require green energy wherever possible. The second one is we require green thermal energy. And the third thing is a secondary material quota that we set for all the products. So each product line has a very clear secondary material target. Actually, I think the first two are rather easy, especially the first to substitute gray for green energy is really easy in most of the markets. In some markets, you still have an energy market that is very conservative. There it's hard. So we work also together with trade unions there to get more green energy into the market even. So to have the basis for our suppliers to be able to source this green energy. The hardest part, to be honest, is secondary material quotas. So we buy everything that we get in terms of quality. It's very hard in the car industry to get the quality that you need for example, for secondary steel. We have a very strict requirements in terms of performance for the steel. So there, I think we need more secondary material in the quality that we need, and that is also that relates to the recycling industry and how the recycling industry is organized. At the moment, most of the products all end up in one shredder. So what you get out of this shredder is very unclean material. So you get contaminated steel, for example, there is copper in it. That's not usable for us. That usually ends up in the cement industry, in the steel, in the construction sector. So we need a much better separation technology to use these materials.
Vanessa, very, very quickly on that point, Scope 3 suppliers. What is electric? Are you bold enough?
Absolutely, and we put together sort of an overview of the supplier, a full picture of the supplier together with our purchasing team, looking at, of course, the classic pieces, the quality, the price, obviously, but also how are they meeting our social requirements and how are they meeting our climate requirements. And there we are leaning on the CDP program actually to help us. So we're encouraging we're asking all of our suppliers to report through CDP, and now we've taken the first step of saying, okay, now you've reported some, they're at very different levels, and now we're starting to say, okay, and now we're starting to expect a better and better ranking from them. But of course, it's always this working together, explaining why, sharing best practice, and getting the movement to happen.
Li Jiang, are you heartened by what you've heard from the corporates on the panel today?
Well, great. I drive my BMW 525 for about 10 years and decided to change a new electricity car, but I'm waiting for the BMW made a good model in China. So as a consumer, I think what's the choice of the consumer is very important. As I said before, I set up a small company called Green Inclusive network technology together with a former UNEP officer and a couple of friends 2 years ago in China. We called Green Inclusive. And we launched a Green Inclusive Cloud, carbon emission reduction digital ledger based on the group standard of All China Environment Federation quantitative guidelines for greenhouse gas emission reduction by citizen and green and low carbon behaviors. And guided by the Ministry of Ecology and Environment, the Green Inclusive Cloud builds a nationwide, unified and applicable underlying interconnection platform, forms personal and corporate carbon ledgers, and explores diversified model of green finance rebate incentive mechanism in order to crack the carbon emission reduction problem at the consumption end. So if the consumer to take public transportation instead of a private cars, fossil fuel cars, and their carbon emission reduction amount could be calculated and accounted by our APP. And for example, in the past Beijing Winter Olympics, we provide support we called low carbon consumption to support the Beijing Winter Olympics, and over over 3.3 million users joined us, and in total reduced emission by more than 40,000 tons CO2 in about 3 months.
Okay.
So this is an example that how consumer can change their behaviors, and certainly it also drives the producers to produce more green, low carbon products.
Yeah, good. Thank you so much. Look, I want to come back to the title of this, which looks ahead to the next climate COP, and get a sense from each of you. And Irene, let's start with you. What do we want to see? What do we need to see in Egypt that we did not see in Glasgow?
So I think we have very clear targets for nations at the moment. So we have NDCs. And we have private initiatives like SBTI that we also follow that actually break down these NDCs for corporates. But there is no official initiative that basically legitimizes CDCs. So I think it would be very important to have very clear CDCs for multinational companies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Annika?
Well, I fully agree. I think, and what we need to see is that these national plans has to be backed up with very clear actions. And I also would like to see more of a discussions on the regulatory framework that needs to be in place in order to enable that. I think we've already addressed the EU ETS and the driving force on carbon pricing, but we need to secure also for the industry transformation that the policies are in place to enable that. But in general, I would say it's so much more about the actual title. We need to see the clear actions that are taken. So similar as I referred to in the COP26 in Glasgow, where we could show the full value chain of fossil-free steel all the way to how it's used. We need to see much more of those tangible activities.
Vanessa, what do you think?
I would echo what has been said, but I think also it's looking now to the consumers as well and really enabling the consumers, helping us to help show the consumers and to allow them to make more educated choices and see the real difference. I think specifically for us also it is this idea of make it easier for us to make the investments in the greener energy, the greener choices, because it's too difficult.
Go ahead.
I have 4 bullet points I think I would like to say. First, I really appreciate the cooperation Sweden as a government have together with India. And I think those kind of collaborations under the wings of UN, I think is great to understand our differences and to share experiences. That is something we can see more of in Egypt. 2, the synergies. We need to talk about the synergies about climate. Synergies reducing climate impact with health, with more employments, with growth. Talk about the synergies and also the benefits of reducing climate. I think that is the most second important point. And also, there is a handful key solutions. For example, we talked about, Annika talked about fossil-free steel. We need to talk about these key solutions more and stress them. And finally, the most also, even if it's the 4th, the carbon price.
Yeah.
We need to talk about carbon price, if it's the carbon tax, if it's the EU ETS or so. So that is important.
Yeah. If there's enough integrity in the carbon market, the voluntary carbon market as well, I think is another thing that was discussed a lot at 26. Very quickly, Annika?
Yes, I realize one key thing is, I mean, we talk about that a lot of this transformation needs more fossil-free electricity. And I think one thing that worries me and keeps me awake at night is that we need to be able to do it quickly enough. And that means that the permitting processes need to be swifter. And it's also the general thing about acceptance.
Yeah.
In order to do this transformation, we will need access to seabeds, to land, in order to build more of the production and the electricity lines that needs to get to these plants that are going to produce the fossil-free steel or cement.
Yep.
And this acceptance of that not in my backyard is always there. Somehow we need to dare to tackle this one. Of course, it's extremely important to balance all the different interests, and everyone should have their saying. But we must realize that we need this access to land.
Yes, yes. Okay, good. Look, there's one or two more things I want to say very quickly, and then I want to open up to the floor, and then we're going to hear some closing comments from President Kelapile from EcoSoc. The thing I wanted to mention, and we haven't mentioned, are offsets. And what your views are on these. And the reason I bring it up is because I was doing a discussion with another chief executive. I'm not going to tell you who it was, but I'll tell you in a second. But it surprised me. This chief executive said that CEOs are using offsets as a fig leaf. And they shouldn't be. And we need to move away from that. What are your views first on offsets, Annika?
Well, our view is, both my personal and Vattenfall, is that we should do everything we can to remove the carbon that is there. And the offsetting is the very last sort of action that you do when you tried everything else. And right now, the offsetting would need to be taken for the scope 3 that we said is so difficult to tackle. Yep. But here, I think it's more, if we do offsetting, it should be in actual carbon removal. And that's where we need to have bio, energy, CCS, etc. But I fully agree. I'm worried about all these pledges to reach net zero, because a lot of that will be tackled by consumption.
What do you think, Irene, on the offsetting, and how much of your goals are, or how much is offsetting part of your goals?
I'm completely with Annika. You remove as much as you can. So for the production, for example, we have an 80% goal per car until 2030. But we already have a CO2 neutral production since 21 by offsetting. So what we can't get out there, we have a very clear offsetting strategy, and we follow the same strategy actually as the German government. So we buy the same certificates. So we think those are valid certificates to buy. So I think you need to be very, very strict in terms of what kind of certificates you buy, and you need to look very closely what they sell to you, because there is a large market out there. There are claims that you get a ton of CO2 for 3 cents. We don't believe that that's viable. So we really need to have a very stringent strategy there.
Yeah. Vanessa?
We would much rather look at the underlying processes and really change those to make sure that we make them, sustainable, really, truly going forward.
Is that what you're doing?
That's what we're doing, right? So
doing.
we have reached 78% reduction in our scope 1 and 2 already now, ahead of our target for ourselves, which was 25. We're targeting fully neutral in our own operations by 2030. And why have we said 2030? Because we need to get through these tough processes, right? We have heating in all our buildings, enameling, painting, think about an oven or a fridge. It's huge processes and we need to break those down, and that's what we're doing to see where can we actually make a change.
Yeah, very quickly.
Just short, when I talked about our goals in the Haga Initiative and net zero by 2030, we don't count offsets, and that I think is very important. But you can use offsets as an internal price in the company. So that, I think, is a way to move, because then you get probably the right price internally. And also, I think it's correct, very good, like Annika mentioned also, talking about the negative emission in Article 6. I think that is a new challenge. So how to get the negative emissions on place, I think that is the next step in this.
Yeah. By the way, it was Scott Kirby at United Airlines who said that about the fig leaf, which I thought was quite admirable, I must say. Look, I'm going to open it up to our audience for your questions, and then we will get to EcoSoc's president. Yeah, right here.
Is it working? Yes, thank you. So my concern was that it was said that consumers need to pay the bill, but most of the global consumers, they don't have the financial power to do so. And then I was wondering if we're talking about a carbon tax or other costs such as eco-labels, how can we assure that those costs aren't fully transferred to the consumers, and so they can't make a switch to sustainable products? Thank you.
Lee, you've said a bunch about consumers. I don't know if you heard that question. I don't know if you want to tackle that.
Well, it's a really good question that the carbon tax should not only paid by the consumers, but the behavior change of the consumer can drive the producers to produce more and good products with low carbon emission. I think this is a choice of the consumers. Certainly, yes, the carbon tax can play an important role, and I think finally in total the consumers' consumption behavior can make a big impact and big changes, I believe.
Anyone else want to have a go at that?
Yes. So I think once you make the change, it's actually it could also get cheaper. So for example, if I charge my car, I pay €6 per 100 kilometers. If I fuel my car with petrol, I pay €16. So it's already there, yeah, the innovation. So I think that it's twofold. You need to invest and then you get innovation, and that drives prices down because renewable energy is so much cheaper than fossil-based energy. So I think that's very important to have. You might have an initial investment, but in the long run, it's going to be much cheaper for societies.
Okay.
Yep. I was just going to add, from a consumer perspective, what we see is our responsibility is for sure to make the great appliances, right, and make them as energy efficient as possible and resource efficient water, what it may be. We also need to work to help consumers to understand that the behavior needs to change as well and how you use those appliances. We see in our studies that people are washing their clothes or cooking their food in the same way their parents did, right? And there's so much we can change to make that more efficient, more modern, and really make that saving happen for consumers. For us, it's not as easy as which plug you use, right? There, it's really about lowering the temperature of your laundry or using different techniques in cooking that people aren't aware of.
Yeah, Nina?
Yes, I just want to mention circularity and sharing economy. I think these kind of business models is important in the future, otherwise we won't succeed as well. So I will mention this.
Okay, good. Anyone else with a question for our panel? Yeah, gentleman over here.
Hello there, it's Martin Brocklehurst here. My question is to all the corporates. Are you engaging in research to find new specifications for secondary raw materials that are different from primary raw materials, reflecting the point of origin of the secondary raw materials, as has been done by Jaguar Land Rover for aluminium? So in other words, you're not asking for secondary raw materials to the same specification as primary raw materials, but you're actually looking at what they can deliver to you for the reason that you want to use them, so that you don't actually make it more difficult to use the secondary raw materials.
Irene, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. That's a very good question, actually. So before we had, our engineers actually had to prove that the secondary material that they are using is the same quality as the first, as the primary material. And we've changed that. There is a claim now to our engineers that says secondary first. So they actually, if they're using primary material for quality reasons, they need to specify why. So we have changed that claim, and we are very much looking into what kind of secondary material we can actually buy that is different from primary material.
Okay. Anyone else? Electrolux?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, we talked a lot about plastic, because we have a lot of plastics in our products, and recycled plastic is something that's been high on the agenda for us. And we've put it a lot inside the products where you can't really see it. But now we've been doing a lot more testing with putting that in the aesthetic parts of the products where you really can see it. And of course then, you know, with recycled plastics, you think about your classic refrigerator, it's very white. With recycled plastic, you can't get that color, but we're seeing with our results in studies with consumers that that's exactly what they want. And especially when we tell them this is recycled plastic versus this one that is not, then they say, well, I want that one. Why didn't you tell me that, right? So we see for sure there is this demand for it, and that it really encourages us to be able to put that even more like front and center, and tell the story about it, because people want it.
Go ahead, Annika.
And for Vattenfall, we don't buy raw materials, so we rather buy a wind turbine or something, but we have the dialogue with the suppliers specifically to say, for us it's important that it's a low carbon footprint, and then we have discussions, what would it take to have recycled material, what would it take to have new fossil-free material. So that's a constant dialogue, and I think here we try to take our part in the sense that we try to have the dialogue on how to produce the fossil-free steel. We collaborate, and I want to raise another exciting collaboration we have to enable production of sustainable aviation fuels. Here using fossil-free electricity to produce the hydrogen, but then we use the carbon dioxide from our district heating plant, sort of recycling that one into making the sustainable aviation fuel. So we try to do wherever we can, but it's very much for us more having the dialogue with the suppliers.
Yep, okay. Look, I'm going to have to wrap this up, but I do want to finish this, and do stay where you are, because I'd like to invite Colin Kelapile, the president of the UN ECOSOC, onto the stage. Now, ECOSOC, of course, as you all, I'm sure, know, are, I think it's fair to say, custodians of the SDGs. So it would be super to get your view, Mr. President, of what you've heard today from the corporates here ahead of COP27, whether you're heartened by what you've heard here, whether you think a net zero carbon ambition is enough to achieve the SDGs. Please.
No, thank you very much. I can't say I heard everything. I was not here earlier on, but I came at the right time to hear the panelists who just spoke. And let me say that as the moderator has observed, ECOSOC is the platform where the supervision of the implementation of the SDGs and the 2030 agenda takes place. I'm therefore delighted really to hear this very impressive attention to the many aspects that need attention, especially from the companies and the industry that are all here. Let me say that at a time when we are not doing that well in the implementation of the SDGs, any pledge is welcome. We particularly welcome the climate pledge. It is very significant, but we also need to remember it is only part of what we need to do if we are to achieve the 2030 agenda. You would recall that when the 2030 agenda was adopted in 2015, it was clearly the case that the 17 goals are indivisible and integrated. So the agenda is treated as one outfit. This means that meaningful impact can only be realized if we pursued all the goals with equal attention and equal ambition. So those companies that are meeting their 2040 target will certainly help spur the development and deployment of the needed solutions that can help us meet the broader climate goals. And this is hugely important. But I listened also to the panelists that for an impact of scale to move the needle of the SDGs implementation significantly, this requires that many other companies, as you observed, should also be part of this process across many sectors. This, of course, should cover the transport sector, the telecommunications, the power generation sector, and the variety of manufacturing sector, and the biotech and pharmaceuticals, the agriculture, and the retail. So I think I take that point very well. I think you're right on the point that much as we welcome this pledge, there can be more companies that can be part of it. So the deployment of climate solutions can also make an impact if the cost of those solutions is lower, is down. This can make it more affordable across the world. I think the developing countries in particular would also benefit on these solutions if the cost is affordable. the big tech's role in all this means that the digital tools, I listened yesterday also about the importance of monitoring and evaluation. So I think the big tech's role in it will mean that digital tools that are created in the process, such as for monitoring, should also be widely utilized, including in the developing countries. I think this speaks to the subject of the digital divide, the sharing of knowledge and technology across all countries. Let me, building on the integrated nature of the 2030 Agenda and the SDGs, observe that for the action on climate change to have an impact, it should also sort of spur action on the other SDGs, the 16 others. This should include feeding into the efforts to prevent poverty, for example, and hunger, and improving health, and producing more affordable clean energy, and providing decent work. So I'm making that point that climate action is one thing, but the impact on the other SDGs is equally important. One example which dates from 2019 is that more than 6 million people died as a result of bad air quality. So this speaks to the issue of a reduction in fossil fuels to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which could then reduce particulate emissions that kill. So this is one important link that I think actions on the climate science giving actionable results in terms of prevention of death. So let me sum it up again. There are two reasons why this particular pledge is not enough to achieve the SDGs. One is that it covers only some companies and not others. The second one is that climate is only one aspect of the SDGs. So I think there is a need to create the linkages, the cross-cutting linkages with all the other 16 SDGs. I've already referred to clean water and sanitation, good health and well-being, and also life below water and life on land. So I would end here with the challenge to the signatories of the climate pledge that I think they should broaden the focus to target not only the greenhouse gas emissions, but also the ecosystems. Talking about the land, I think Gabon was being referred to yesterday as a very important case. Air and water, plants and animals, and also sustainable value chains. I heard Scope 3 earlier being referred to. One practical opportunity to influence those additional factors will be in the net part of the net zero, for example, where there are carbon sink projects. This can be carefully designed to promote biodiversity, for instance. The additional point, being first movers towards a more circular economy with more sustainable value chains will also bring a competitive advantage in the markets. So let me close it here with another important additional contributor that needs to accompany all these actions. I think we've all realized that it is very crucial to improve access to education on all our populations on the importance of protecting the environment. So I think this should accompany all the efforts that are going on. And of course, the point I made in the context of technology transfer, I think collaboration with the developing countries in particular in all interventions and solutions is very key. But otherwise, I want to thank you, moderator, and the panelists. The views you are expressing at this particular event are very crucial in feeding into ECOSOC. I mentioned in July, we have a very important event which I look forward to seeing as many of you, if not all, participating. This is the high-level political forum on sustainable development, which will start on the 5th of July in New York. I thank you very much again.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. President. And look, I want to thank our panel as well for your contribution and to the two speakers who came remotely. It was a great way to end this. It's not quite the final session, but the penultimate session. So thank you, and Irene and Li Zhang, thanks to you both as well. We are now going to serve lunch in here, as we did yesterday. After that, we're going to head out just across the way there, 10 meters to the China Theatre, very much on our doorstep. William and the SPBF team will lead the way there. That's for the concluding session, Stockholm plus 100, Shaping Our Common Future. It's going to be a really fun session, a number of TED-style talks, very quick ones, 3-4 minute talks, so I think there's going to be a lot of energy in the theatre there. Don't worry, by the way, if you've left your coats in the cloakroom or anything in the cloakroom, all of that is going to be brought over to the theatre. So that will save you the trouble of picking it up beforehand. After that, we're going to head over to the garden, the Kunstgarten, to hear Ricky Cage and Ellie Golding, which should be fun, and to see, of course, that legacy art piece that we heard so much about yesterday. So have a great lunch. We'll see you at the theatre after lunch. Thanks very much.